In August of 2014, 10 years ago, a major event in indie gaming occurred that would change the course of indie gaming history, as well as gaming history as a whole. Well, actually, there were two moments in gaming history which happened. One was an event in indie games which came with some baggage, one which would question whether indie games could be taken as a form of art beyond being simply entertainment for kids, teenagers, and adults, one in which credible gaming journalists and critics may not have taken seriously at first glance, an event that saw a community strongly united, yet could get incredibly cringy and sometimes toxic, and a figurehead in charge with some problematic politics and views which you could say were terrifying and horrifying. And the other event was Gamergate. You remember that? The Gamergate movement? That was about ethics in gaming journalism, actually, but wasn't actually about ethics at all. In fact, it was a Trojan horse for right-wing hysterical outrage towards better representation of women and non-white characters in art, and yes, that includes video games, and how indie games in particular, along with their developers, were targeted for being one of the only avenues where better representation was displayed. Yeah, it's a very weird coincidence that one of the most toxic events in video games history happened right around the time the video game industry, specifically the indie horror game scene, would be shocked by the introduction of one of the most popular and financially lucrative franchises in video game history, all of which, despite its varied reception from critics, emerged from indie gaming during a decade when we saw some of the greatest achievements and technological advances in the indie game avenue, never mind the capacity to tell compelling and engaging stories which could complement their vibrant worlds, which is why, however disheartening and depressing it might be, it's necessary to remember how Gamergate represented a dark and stressing time, especially for the women and minorities, developers, and journalists who were harassed. But how and why did Gamergate emerge, and why is Gamergate and this gaming franchise connected besides emerging in the same month almost exactly a decade ago? Why do we even need to remember how Gamergate emerged? Isn't it better if we pretend it never happened and wasn't a broader part of a changing and problematic turn in politics in America and abroad? Right now, we are living in a time in which we're seeing gaming studios forced to shut down, and major corporations like Microsoft firing game developers who contributed to some of the best-selling and or critically acclaimed games, all while a teeny tiny minority of anti-woke, anti-SJW personalities cheer on these firings and cutbacks while depicting these developers, aka workers, as disposable because, I don't know, things are quote-unquote too woke. Never mind that the only people who seem to benefit from these cutbacks are those already on top, which none of these chuckleheads ever complain about. And I want to explore all of these questions regarding indie gaming, Gamergate, and the right-wing hysterical online culture war, which would emerge in various forms like Comicsgate and the fandom menace, how this echoes into video game fandom, and why we need to support indie games and indie developers now, more than ever, while they face financial hardship and massive cutbacks. But I want to do it in a way that's creative, and for which no one has ever done before on YouTube. And in order to do that, I want this exploration to coincide with a massive retrospective look back at a franchise every gamer young and old must have heard of before or played, but maybe they weren't interested, found better games, or perhaps needed a refresher. Or perhaps they are fans of this series, but want a unique perspective on a series they love, and all of which emerged beyond the indie gaming world despite a disastrous Kickstarter fund, and a whole barrage of wrong-headed theorizing, drama, and controversy, which will be pointed out here and there. And, like a hawk eyeing its prey, I became very, very, very interested in this series last year, as I was finishing up the script for my Gone Home video essay, for reasons which will be outlined in these videos. But I can't simply talk about or even criticize the gaming franchise in question and all of its faults, and I can't simply judge it on one single game, because that would be like judging a book based on its cover, or in this case, the first book in a series. I want to know why this other significant event in gaming history that happened a decade ago mattered then and still matters to countless gamers, and I want to know the appeal before the franchise got decent yet repetitive before it got cringy yet melancholic, before it got tragically nightmarish, before it threw a wild, uneven knuckle curveball, before it got entertaining and engaging, before it got a nice little send-off for fans, and sadly, before it had the potential to progress the franchise as a whole and ruined it with a garbage fire failure. I want to try and put myself in the shoes of a gamer trying this game out exactly 10 years ago, before the popularity took over, before the toxic fandom and dramas, the Let's Play craze of YouTube, and insanely crazy fan theories, and of course, the lore. I want to know if and why Five Nights at Freddy's holds up. On the 8th of August 2014, the indie game scene and, more broadly, the gaming world saw the release of a little point-and-click horror game entitled Five Nights at Freddy's, or FNAF for short. The game follows the protagonist, Mike Schmidt, no relation to the Hall of Fame Philadelphia Phillies third baseman, as he works his new night shift job at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza as the new security guard, checking the hallway lights and pulling the monitor to see if anyone or somebody may be trespassing. But lest you think this job would be another boring night watch gig making sure this dump of a place is all secure, Mike's new responsibilities involve not just keeping an eye on the place, but also on himself, as the pizzeria's 4 animatronics, Bonnie the Bunny Rabbit, Chica the Chicken, Foxy the Pirate Fox, and the pizzeria's mascot Freddy Fazbear, move through the place due to being in some kind of free roam mode, and since they might mistake him for a naked endoskeleton, the animatronics will try to shove you into an empty Freddy Fazbear suit, which will kill you if you can't tell by the eyeballs popped out in front of the head there. The initial price for this game was $5. Today it's $7.99 both on Steam and at the Nintendo store, which is pretty generous considering when playing the game from night 1 to 7 without death, gameplay can take at least an hour or so to get through one straight playthrough. If only modern AAA studios could take a cue from this and agree they don't have to make us pay $59 to $99 for a reskin. At first glance, from looking at the cover and the game's trailer, gamers might have pointed and laughed at how goofy or more appropriately, creepy the animatronic designs were. Walking versions of animals like bears, bunnies, and chickens, yet so lifelike and non-threatening. Hell, when I first saw the trailer back before its release in 2014, I thought to myself, sure, the ambient music gives off creepy vibes, but there's no way anyone would be scared by any of these things. I mean, just look at how adorable this bunny looks before he rips his face off. It certainly didn't help matters that the Kickstarter for this game got a whopping $0 in funding for its development. Needless to say, the world seemed to be against this game having any success. But we all know what came next. Five Nights at Freddy's did not go the way of the dodo and forever discounted in the dustbin of Steam games. Instead, the first FNAF game was the beginning of a global phenomenon, transitioning from indie gaming to a major gaming franchise. The first game alone has sold millions of copies, and it certainly helped that between 2014 and 2015, 4 Five Nights at Freddy's games were released which kept the fan base's hunger for more games satisfied. Large YouTube channels were able to spread the word about the game and would garner millions and millions of views just by playing them, guaranteeing that more gamers would catch on, which they did. There's a band that likes to make songs based on the FNAF games. There's a whole series of books which started with the Silver Eyes, despite greatly drifting from the source material they were based on. And there's even a FNAF movie which came out in 2023, which also differs greatly from the first game, but who cares about that? Look at how lifelike and how accurate these Jim Henson Creature Shop FNAF animatronics look like the versions from the game. However, in full disclosure, despite being around on YouTube when these games were gaining traction and seeing countless channels and YouTube personalities recording Let's Plays while gaming to these games, I was not as invested in this franchise as other YouTubers, and was never the biggest fan of Five Nights at Freddy's because I couldn't connect with the games upon trying out the first game. The first time I played Five Nights at Freddy's way back almost a decade ago, I didn't really understand the hype, and it was a game I mostly forgot about other than being reminded it exists because of a Let's Play stream I may have glossed over while surfing YouTube in recent years. Perhaps it was because at the time when the first game was released, the horror genre of gaming didn't interest me as well as first-person shooters, Metroidvanias, or sports games. Or maybe it was the jump scares. Oh, not the fear of being jump scared, of course, but from hearing other gamers say how the jump scares became more repetitive. More on that later. I used to be so apathetic about this franchise that I would refer to these games as Friday Nights at Freddy's. You work on Fridays during your Five Nights at Freddy's, I presume, but that's how much I couldn't give a shit about these games. Admittedly, my taste for indie gaming, and for that matter, film, literature, and music, at the time was a little selective. Some might call it me being a pretentious R-school, liberal school know-it-all who thinks he knows it all kind of thing, and who's too cool for this new fad emerging in the gaming scene. And it's weird for me to admit this, because despite the horror genre not being my preferred means of entertainment, not just in gaming but also in film and literature, I actually grew up as a child being exposed to rated R horror flicks. You know the classics, whether it's being a kid who grew up by the ocean but who's too afraid to swim because they saw Jaws for the first time, dreading dreaming of being in space because of watching Ridley Scott's Alien, having my culturally Irish Catholic background being shaken in terror because of one midnight family watch of The Exorcist, or being paranoid of others due to watching John Carpenter's The Thing. And growing up and watching more horror films, despite not being my go-to genre, I like to think I have a decent taste for the horrific and terrifying, and the horror genre allows for storytellers to craft such compelling and engaging worlds, sometimes with thoughtful analogies to our lives and real-world events, while horror directors keep their audiences up at night. And yet, despite trying out the first Five Nights at Freddy's on my desktop computer 10 years ago, I just couldn't connect with this game, and so I didn't bother with it to the point I almost forgot about FNAF. What I couldn't forget was how so many gamers and YouTubers were talking, dissecting, live streaming, let's playing, and jump scaring themselves with the Five Nights at Freddy's games, devoting themselves to years of uploading this word, content onto their channels. Endless streams of custom nights from 420 mode to 1020 to 5020, video essays presenting elaborate, convoluted, and sometimes dead wrong theories regarding certain characters and animatronics and significant dates. And as someone who is always open to discussing video games beyond the plain old mechanics, it seemed like there was a lot more to this, and this video game series has been on my mind recently, so I have wanted to talk about it for a very long time, a few years even, but I didn't quite know how to do so appropriately and how to approach it. That is until last year. So starting exactly a year ago, a little while after I premiered my video essay Why Gone Home Does Not Hold Up, a Gone Home 10-year retrospective, which is a video essay I stand by and feel pretty proud of making, I started to do the thing I should have done years ago, making my Freddy curiosity into a devoted passion project, and got myself caught up with the series. I played the first Five Nights at Freddy's game for countless hours, as well as its 3 direct sequels, FNAF 2 to 4, Sister Location, and Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, aka Five Nights at Freddy's 5 and 6 respectively, Ultimate Custom Night, and even, and reluctantly, Security Breach. I played games not essential to the main storyline, such as FNAF World, the Freddy in Space games, and Fury's Rage. I also read the books Silver Eyes and other various Freddy books, and I even made time last year to watch the first feature-length Five Nights at Freddy's movie. Twice. 3 times actually, and I took the time to sit back, relax, and to read the first edition of the FNAF strategy book, The Freddy Files. The hell with... No, really. The book is called The Freddy Files. 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 What's next? Bonnie's Bunnies? Chica's Chickens? The Freddy Files. Needless to say, I know more about the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise than I did a year ago, and I can definitively tell you, even after 10 years of having played the first game, that, unfortunately, no, Five Nights at Freddy's, as in the franchise as a whole, does not hold up. Now, perhaps the title of this very first part of this saga might confuse you, given me saying that Five Nights at Freddy's holds up. But again, when I say Five Nights at Freddy's does not hold up, I don't mean to say the first game is bad or doesn't hold up. I mean that when taking it as a whole, the entire Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, consisting of the games, the books, and the film, has never held up, nor do I think it's worthy of being called an all-time great achievement in indie game development, despite the massive amount of money and fans the series brings in. Nevertheless, despite my issues, I think there's a lot that could be explored, and I want to take an angle on the franchise that no other YouTuber or critic has attempted to do, and whether I am successful or not in doing so, I hope I can shed a new perspective on these games, and make something not just for non-fans, haters, and gamers who are apathetic to the series, but those who might be morbidly curious to find out more like I did a year ago. But also, for FNAF fans who want a different take from your typical fanboy viewpoint as someone who is not a fan of the franchise, because ultimately, regardless whatever you think of the franchise as a whole, these games do matter to some people, and the indie world and gaming media critics can't simply brush them off and try their best to ignore them due to some blunders, flaws, and noted controversies within the FNAF community. So with that said, just like my Gone Home video essay, which premiered almost a year ago from this one, this Five Nights at Freddy's 10-year retrospective and very first part of the Forever Freddy saga will serve as a critique and retrospective of the first game, where, despite my apathy and or dislike for several aspects of this franchise, I will attempt to be mostly complimentary and positive towards the first game. But that will not be the case for most of these games going forward. After this first part, I will talk about each game in a brief manner, as well as give time to other games in the franchise, the books, the film, and all of this while trying to explore what are the themes, the almost incomprehensible, convoluted lore, at least for non-fans of the series, and what I think might be the definitive subtext of the series as a whole. And, this goes without saying, this retrospective critique will contain spoilers for Five Nights at Freddy's, as well as the other games, books, and film. So let's begin. But first, we must take a dive into gaming history. Indie gaming history. What is an indie game? It's a question which seems easy to answer, but ask anyone in gaming, a casual gamer, a game developer, or the head of a major gaming corporation, and they'll give you a variety of answers. Speaking from my experience, I had always assumed the term indie gaming was separate from mainstream AAA gaming, and it's partially true, but there's a lot more to it. An indie game developer is someone who works in developing games outside of the AAA gaming world. These game developers may have had experience working in AAA game development, like for example Lucas Pope, developer of Return of the Obra Dinn, who had previous experience with Naughty Dog, or could be complete newbies when starting out and make a game that looks like it took hundreds of people to work on. My favorite example of the latter category is the development of the pixelated farm simulator Stardew Valley, and its developer, programmer, and designer all in one, Concerned Ape, aka Eric Barone, who according to the book Blood, Sweat, and Pixels by well-respected gaming journalist Jason Strider spent at least 7 years developing the game straight out of college with a computer programming degree, devoting 8 to 15 hours on making this colorful, vibrant world, which paid homage to the Harvest Moon franchise. See also, and more recently, Shared Memories' Billy Basso, who spent 7 years doing sound design and work on the soundtrack, the pixelated artwork, and level design for perhaps my favorite game of 2024 so far, Animal. Possibly one of the greatest Metroidvanias in recent memory, and he even did the voice work for the animals. While these developers are the ones who are making these games, finding a publisher can be difficult, unless you're able to self-publish, which is a whole other matter. But this has gotten quite better thanks to a number of publishers who specialize in publishing memorable indie games. To give a few examples, Annapurna Interactive makes me want to revisit the Finch house in What Remains of Edith Finch, and contemplate my own mortality, and also to play Stray again, because I don't get why people dislike this game profusely. I know when I look at the Devolver digital logo, I think of all those times I had to try and retry shooting my way out of dirty jobs in Hotline Miami. Finji makes me think how I want to go back and play Night in the Woods during one cool autumn season, and then play it again and again until I can come up with my first video essay in 3 years. Man, I never get tired of that game. Heck, we don't even have to be talking solely about video games being indie. We could talk about indie directors, musicians, and writers. Indie films can allow for auteur writer-directors to flex their muscles and/or prep up before trying to make it in the rip and tear world of Hollywood, or be given the opportunity to tell stories Hollywood doesn't typically highlight, with actors looking to showcase their acting chops in between bigger projects. Indie music and records, while not always charting on the Billboard charts, can allow for a whole lot of varied music which it doesn't sound overtly commercial, especially in genres like indie rock. The word indie itself signifies independence and making something, a piece of art or entertainment that feels true, which feels personal, and the hope is that the person enjoying what the indie artist has made will find a way that they can relate to this art. This is not to say that one can find personal value in major AAA games. Take it from someone who loves talking about The Legend of Zelda and other Nintendo franchises like Mario and Star Fox. But rather, the freedom to be an indie artist, even with the constraints, roadblocks, and expected crunch time in indie development, allows for such a wide, diverse catalog of games at your fingertips, or preferably a physical copy if you can buy it. For those looking to learn more about the subject, a fantastic introduction to the world of indie game development is this book suited for coffee table reading by Bufavi Zubile, entitled Indie Games: History, Artwork, Sound Design of Independent Video Games. Instantly rereadable and filled with colorful, vibrant illustrations and screenshots from countless indie games released in recent years, it's a book I would reference the hell out of for this chapter. But for the sake of timing, I think this passage in the book's introduction is relevant for this discussion, as we are trying to figure out what the label indie really means. So, indie, it turns out, was originally a label created by a media group that designates certain games and promote both its trade shows and its websites covering these types of games and developers. It is now used by everyone in the video game industry because it has eminently positive connotations, as if the label were a guarantee of authenticity in a world of intensive consumption, where the offerings are infinite and the variations on well-known products are never-ending. She also provides a working definition for indie in the chapter for indie game history and defines an indie game as, quote, a piece of work produced by a single designer or by a very small team of people. After you finish any AAA game, say in the Legend of Zelda series or maybe Grand Theft Auto or Halo, you're greeted by a very long list of hundreds of people: programmers, artists, sound designers, musicians, quality assurance, workers who spent countless hours collaborating on worlds gamers never want to leave after their first encounter, like Hyrule, Vice City, or the Halo rings. However, not only can indie games create worlds that are just as appealing and worthy of revisiting, but these games have advantages modern AAA games don't have, despite budgetary limitations and, though not always the case, the lack of hundreds of workers to help support a game's development. If you were to go way back in time and try out Eric Chai's Another World, you play through one of the most gorgeous rotoscoped space exploration games which looks so modern despite being decades old and all programmed by one guy. The highly influential 2013 platformer Fez, made by the small team Polytron, is one of my favorite pleasure games which, while borrowing from obvious past influences, feels so innovative once you figure out how to navigate the colorful 2D, no, check that, 3-dimensional world, all while playing to one of the most fantastic gaming soundtracks by Disasterpiece, who also did the soundtrack for Hyper Light Drifter, another one of my favorite games. And for more extreme cases of indie game development, some indie games can allow you to simulate a rural lifestyle, like the aforementioned Stardew Valley, thanks to Eric Barone, or maybe entrap you on an isolated remote island a la Myst, forcing you to use your brain to solve hundreds and hundreds of problems like Jonathan Blow's The Witness, and hope you don't blow it.
I can't do this anymore for now.
This is just a small sample of examples, but judging from recent history, the variety of indie titles available is near seamless, and the stories of how these games are made, despite the hardships of real-world economics and capitalism, are inspirational. However, I think there is a problem with the way we talk about indie games, as Soulve brings up how the 2013 film Indie Game the Movie features the development of games such as Fez and Braid, and some of the game developers behind these games such as Polytron's Phil Fish, who's been embroiled in several controversies, some by his own doing, and who has hardly been heard from since announcing Fez 2 was cancelled, and the aforementioned Jonathan Blow, the latter who, judging by let's just say, recent tweets and YouTube rants, is someone who comes off as quite the blowhard, and arguably one of, if not the most toxic person in game development. The problem I see after watching the film for this essay is the framing of the lone game developer being the only path to making successful indie games is a very problematic stereotype, because it depicts the idea that in order to develop an indie game like the aforementioned Braid or Stardew Valley, such games can only be conceived by one lone person. Phil Fish might be the go-to face people think of when they think of Fez, but this ignores the other members of Polytron who were part of the game's development. And despite Jonathan Blow blowing many hours, days, months, and years into his games, he didn't just blow into gaming relevance all by himself, as he was part of the development of several other games. Keep this in mind for people watching at home, especially those who happen to be fans of a certain franchise involving a quirky big old teddy, or in this case, Freddy Bear. But the somewhat wrong-headed assumption here is that this one person in the spotlight of a game's development must be a genius and not prone to error. Obviously it's not true, and learning to make games takes time to gain experience, and any advice you may have gotten from a veteran game developer might have been passed over from somebody else. I'll give you one last example of a world which could only come from developing your own game independently. This game. My game, a game which is part RPG, part dog walking simulator, part Metro City simulator, and a whole lot more. This game is still in development, by the way. That's why there are some gaps in time in between premiering video essays, so now you know. And also, you don't need to know more about this project because I don't want to spoil the whole thing here. And I want to be clear about this because I don't want to be encouraging the lone game developer stereotype. I did not learn how to make all of this on my own. No, this game's gotten to the point because of the help and support of several other people who offered me advice on coding, artwork, and sound design. And the pixelated artwork's a lot of fun to do for the apartments and all, but the coding's always a bugger. But while this game may be leagues away from being finished, if it even gets published, you can see from this small little demo how it all seems easy to make a brand new indie game all on your own, like in my case. This 2D pixelated artwork looks so simple to make if you notice the apartments, trees, benches, fire hydrants, and sewers. What is forgotten, however, and what I've come to learn, is how many minutes, hours, days, weeks, and months it takes to really perfect the vision you want, and what you want your potential players to experience. Like, this is something I have to remind myself all the time when it comes to this gaming project, and, well, video essays like this. But I know I will get there in time. Anyway, getting back to the history of indie gaming, the indie scene has also served as a space for one genre, which is rich in potential and inspiration, but one which, at least for me, I never paid mind to until doing research on my own. Horror. Here's a fun fact. Technically speaking, id Software's Doom is an indie game. Okay, like, that game doesn't jump out to you as an example of indie gaming, or for that matter, exclusively horror, since it's mostly shotgun pumping action, and also id Software is part of Bethesda, but technically Doom was an indie game since id Software released the game on their own, even though the indie gaming label really wasn't a thing back then. And Doom, like other major horror franchises in gaming like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, have their landmark games that have sold countless copies. But sometimes AAA horror games have blind spots which could be filled by the potential of indie development. Take the games Limbo and Inside for example, which were developed by Danish game studio Playdead, with Limbo and its very minimalist presentation and black and white color palette, avoiding giant spiders and other traps and ways to get your little boy playable character killed and butchered. And yet, it takes inspiration from platformers of the past while adding a macabre and tragic twist, one which makes playing this addicting and forgiving game all the more worth revisiting again and again. And speaking of games which could always be replayed, I can't help but point out the horror aspect in a game like Team Cherry's Hollow Knight, especially in everyone's favorite deep area called Deep Nest, with its eerie ambient soundtrack and all of the armies of infected orange goose spiders. However, we live in strange times when we can use the voices and art in indie game development, as major companies like Microsoft and Sony continue to lay off hundreds of workers who have spent countless hours being part in the development of AAA games, and worse, some of the most notable indie game studios being forced to shut down. It seems depressing to think and to remind people, but every month of this year, there was at least one indie company having to shut down, or one major corporation letting go hundreds of hardworking developers, even as they had a part in developing AAA games. This games industry article really irritated me when reading it, as it quotes a bunch of gaming insiders, more like bosses, CEOs, and venture capitalists, the people who care more about money than creativity, and how the trend of layoffs and studio closures will keep happening now and through 2025. But this quote was pretty telling as to how these people really feel about game developers, and also assumes COVID was in the past when in reality it's still affecting the economy and people's health. Too many games were greenlit in 2020 and 2021, one publisher boss said. We need to get to pre-pandemic levels in terms of the release schedule, and that's probably going to take 2 years. You can already see publishers signing fewer games. That's happening everywhere. The stores are saturated, not just Steam, and the games just aren't delivering the levels they were. And for a comprehensive, well-written look at how dark things have gone in indie game development, here's this article in Wired from July entitled "Death Occurs in the Dark. Indie video game devs are struggling to survive." And in this piece, it summarizes the difficulty in small studios being able to raise funds for development, but I think the crucial passages are perfect quotes to summarize the situation. The video games industry seems to be in free fall. How any particular company lands, though, depends on their size. When large companies like Microsoft, Unity, Electronic Arts, or Ubisoft want to tighten their belts, they do layoffs, but the company itself still exists. For independent game makers, the fallout is more existential, since they're often run by small teams of fewer than a couple dozen people. Belt tightening can often mean simply shutting down. When indies disappear, players are losing more than they know. With fewer, smaller, creative teams to make experimental games, players will have fewer choices, or chances, to find games that speak to them or surprise them. Sometimes though, the line between an indie game and a major title can get blurred, even if the gaming experience is enjoyable and we don't pay attention to whatever label we place on a game. For example, while some gamers might know that Microsoft acquired Minecraft, which has become one of the biggest selling games over the last decade or so, very few people would know that Minecraft initially was considered an indie title, and its once small company, Mojang Studios, is now a subsidiary of Microsoft with hundreds of employees, despite the game's programmer having sold his shares and made his billions knowing he's left a positive impact. I wonder what that guy is up to. And I know I keep bringing up Stardew Valley as an example of indie game success, but Stardew Valley's sales were not limited to only a few 100,000 copies. No, the game has sold 30 million copies. Again, this is not simply indie, it's a major hit. There's something unique and extraordinary in how games like Minecraft and Stardew Valley were once thought insignificant. Now they're almost inescapable when you go to YouTube and search for gaming videos. Another example of the blurring line when we defined indie games was the controversy over the last Game Awards nominations for Best Indie Game, which included Dave the Diver, a game which I critiqued in a video essay which premiered on my channel just this year in June. And yet, Dave the Diver was technically not an indie game since the game development company who made the game is a subsidiary of a larger South Korean gaming company, something the game's development team even admitted. While this doesn't take away the fantastic gameplay and story of Dave the Diver, this controversy clouds our definition of what it means to be an indie game. Are all recent indies with fancy 2D pixel art truly indie if we're checking the sources of funding for these games and finding something suspicious? Is indie gaming truly separate from the AAA gaming market, or is it already part of the mainstream? And then there's Five Nights at Freddy's. After I finished reading Subulei's book on indie gaming, I checked the book's index to see what games she referenced, and then I went back and skimmed a few pages and realized, wait, she brings up Minecraft as an example of an indie game which went beyond the indie label, but at no point in the book she mentions Five Nights at Freddy's. Why is this? Why is it that Five Nights at Freddy's got completely glossed over as an indie success, despite the massive catalog of Let's Play videos which were crucial in the game's promotion, and unlike many of the games mentioned in the book, has its own feature-length film which was a box office success, impressive considering it was released a few years into an ongoing deadly pandemic. This is what motivated me to begin this Forever Freddy saga. If we're going to sing the praises of games like Cuphead, What Remains of Edith Finch, and especially Hollow Knight, then we need to talk about why Five Nights at Freddy's matters for indie game development, and why it holds up. And by holds up, again, I mean the first game. The rest of the series, well, The funny thing about horror gaming as a whole is that when it comes to skimming through the history of horror gaming, there really isn't a conflict between AAA and indie horror gaming, since the horror genre as a whole is such a niche avenue that it can allow for stories to be told whether it takes one or a few people to develop a game, or hundreds in the case of any Resident Evil title. And Five Nights at Freddy's came at a time when horror games in the indie realm were evolving beyond shooting enemies and monsters like the many zombies in Resident Evil or the many in System Shock 2. The very definition of being scared in gaming was changing, and FNAF to a degree was part of that change, even if the book leaves it out, though it should be noted that the Indie Games book does not ignore indie horror gaming, as it brings up Limbo and its beautiful black and white imagery. And more importantly, in relation to this conversation, it cites one key series that was pivotal not just for indie horror gaming, but for the crossover between the genre and YouTube: Amnesia. Specifically the first entry in the series, Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Released in 2010, the game puts you in the shoes of a protagonist who wakes up in a Prussian castle he must explore and learn more about its mysteries, while avoiding enemies. During gameplay, his sanity can be affected if he is left in the dark for too long, unless you light a candle with a tinderbox. The Dark Descent was a major milestone in indie horror, as it won several awards at the 2011 Independent Games Festival, or IGF, including the Excellence in Audio and Technical Excellence Awards. And also, this was the year Minecraft won the grand prize. Guess you could say from small things, big things, and so on. It's very fitting that Amnesia won those two specific awards that year, because as a survival game, it puts more focus on exploration and immersion than simple combat and action-packed scares. As you will no doubt tell when you load up the game, the developers outright tell you, Amnesia should not be played to win. Instead, focus on immersing yourself in the game's world and story. Sounds like my kind of game, if y'all ask me. And in many ways, it reminds me of my first playthrough of Looking Glass Studios' masterpiece, Thief: The Dark Project, beyond the similar naming scheme. The fact that there are circumstances that making killing people not so simple in the Dark Project, like being able to hide a body and or making noise to avoid being detected, means the game forces you to act in stealth mode. And while Looking Glass Studios' other masterpiece, System Shock 2, can be played on stealth, given its sci-fi action is combined with the horror of watching crew members get infected, it lacks what made the Dark Project stood out and unquestionably helped to inspire future games like Amnesia. This blog post does a pretty good job summarizing horror gaming history and highlighting some notable indie horror games which go back as far as the 1980s, but I want to quote the concluding paragraph because this illustrates what I'm trying to get at better than I can. So yes, it isn't so much a case of indie versus mainstream horror games, but more of a symbiosis between the two things. Horror games started out as something made by indie bedroom programmers and the occasional medium-large, by the standards of the time, games company. Then they became mainstream. Then they fell out of the mainstream and became indie again. And these days, most horror games are indie games, but there's a lot of two-way cross-pollination between them, and the few AAA horror games that come out these days. Just like with most of video game development history, horror gaming was started by small programmers without the budgets required to make, say, Resident Evil 7. So they had to make up for this gap somehow, and this can be summarized by each of these games' atmosphere. Wonder if that's going to come up later. This is evident in the way you allow yourself to be immersed in the castle in Amnesia: The Dark Descent, focusing on nothing but what you can see on the walls and floor and pay attention to noise cues letting you know when to hide. And as I had mentioned, today the definition of an indie horror game has expanded, and not every game needs some blood splattering to create scares. Some games, like the fantastic 2023 fishing game Dredge, incorporate horror with the replayability which comes from completing a round of fishing coast to coast, creating a combination of terror and pleasure gaming. Believe me, I failed to mention just how much of a pleasure game Dredge is in my Dave the Diver video essay, even though Dredge does get creepy at times, and see also the Dave the Diver Dredge crossover DLC. And some indie games, which aren't necessarily horror, do incorporate horror elements. The 2018 Lucas Pope game Return of the Obra Dinn, while mostly a puzzle game involving the protagonist trying to figure out the fates of each of the passengers on a ship, it, like Dredge, includes Lovecraftian monsters in its morbid mystery, like it's all captured in several frames. Or, in the game's case, memories for every passenger's death. Darkwood is so unbelievably fucking bleak and dark that all the imagery and brutality of the game's world is scary enough to not warrant jump scares to keep people up at night. Again, I wonder if that will come up later. Even a small indie horror like The Cat Lady, without giving much away, reminds me of Gaspar Noé's 2009 film Enter the Void, but the contemplative afterlife the game creates is less psychedelic and more morbid the more the protagonist comes across different versions of her own dead body. And again, I don't want to take away from the joy of playing AAA horrors. God knows how many times I've loved pumping shells into zombie arcade style like any House of the Dead game or Resident Evil game. However, all of the aforementioned indie horror games evoke scares, terrors, and other emotions AAA games aren't able to do. But Five Nights at Freddy's isn't like any of those horror games. No, it's a different breed of horror gaming. You could say it's horror of a quirky kind. So, let's start. It's 1993, at least that's what fans agree on, and it's midnight during your first night shift at your new job, and your name's Mike Schmidt. Again, not related to the Hall of Fame Philadelphia Phillies third baseman. Your job, keep Freddy Fazbear's pizza safe and secure from intruders, and check who tries to go in and who's moving inside the pizzeria. Specifically, those adorable, unbearably cute 4 animatronics: Freddy Fazbear, Bonnie the Rabbit, or Bonnie Chica the Chicken, and he's Foxy, Foxy the Pirate. It's his cove and you're just checking it. Fox, we're in the wrong game.
Nice one, Foxy!
Nice one, Foxy. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Foxy the Pirate Fox. Your new job from 12 to 6 a.m. consists of checking the hallways left to right and pulling the security monitor to see each room's camera in the establishment, and also turning on the hallway lights briefly. Because power at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza is terrible, but then again, utility companies that are not unionized are usually pretty bad at checking power anyway. And you have to keep in check with your power since you start out with 100% power at 12 a.m., but power becomes delicate every time you turn on the lights, check on the monitor, and especially if you shut the door for too long. Because you know who doesn't have to worry about running out of power? The animatronics. That's right, the 4 adorable, colorful animatronics are not just here to entertain children during the night. They also like to wander around the place at night, and they're also not fans of adults, or maybe they think someone like you might be an endoskeleton without a suit. And if you're not too careful and delicate with power, one of the animatronics just might try and stuff you into another Freddy Fazbear suit, which isn't safe or fun, because you might just die if that happens and your eyes will pop out from the front. But this is a job and a task you can't afford to lose. After all, you do need to earn your way to that sweet $120. Oh, and there's an additional 6th night you can play that if you win, you get some nice overtime pay, which comes to 50 cents. Oh, and there's also a custom 7th night you can play where you can mess around with the AI levels for the animatronics, and you can even play it with all their AI levels up to 20, hence, 420, because there's 4 animatronics at AI level 20. Oh, and you get fired on your 7th night for fucking around with the difficulty of the animatronics, and also you get an automatic face-to-face with this yellow bear if you enter this. So that was a half-assed summary of the game for those who have never tried out Five Nights at Freddy's. Obviously, there's a lot I left out, and of course I tried my best to ignore the lore for the moment. But for those who have played the game either casually or if you're a dedicated fan looking for a case for why Five Nights at Freddy's is the best Five Nights at Freddy's game, I think what really sold this game, besides everyone wanting to join in on the jump scare fun, were a number of positive qualities this game had, which I want to dissect in this chapter. Specifically, the gameplay, the sound design, the environmental storytelling, and how the game's atmosphere is complemented by the sense of mystery all around the game's pizzeria. So, despite the plethora of problems I have with the series as a whole, if I were to be as generous as possible, I truly believe that the first game is the best game in the series, not just for its easy gameplay making it the most accessible to play, both in its difficulty and as convenience to kill time, but for how the game forces the gamer to enter a state of flow while learning how to avoid jump scares. Me being the boomer gamer for this franchise in contrast to the pre-teen and teenage audience that gravitated towards this franchise, while I don't think the game is as difficult for newcomers to try to get to at least night 5, I can see why people enjoy these games beyond just playing the first game. As the series progressed in its quote-unquote golden era run from FNAF 1 to Ultimate Custom Night, aka UCN for short, the games added new mechanics and ways to avoid getting jump scared, from a Freddy Fazbear mask to wear in FNAF 2, and a flashlight to ward off Withered Foxy in FNAF 2, and a music box which you need to wind up, and audio lures and ventilation doors to keep Springtrap away from you in FNAF 3, and yet I feel like for casual non-FNAF gamers, FNAF 2 and 3, amongst later titles, added more emphasis on the player being able to multitask. And when we get to Sister Location and Pizzeria Simulator, while the game's ever-spanning story would focus primarily on the lore for the worst, these two games at least tried to add some quirks for jump scare avoidance. The only game in the series that comes close to FNAF 1's simple yet smooth and effective gameplay is FNAF 4, despite that game putting more focus on the gamer paying attention to audio cues like footsteps, breathing, and laughter, which let you know when to flash the flashlight or shut the bedroom door. So while I would agree that the biggest drawback in gameplay with Five Nights at Freddy's 1 would be that the gameplay gets easier and easier, I would argue that this is because the gamer has gotten so used to specific cues such as the footsteps which close in on your office, the light noise accompanied by the string sound effect letting you know to shut the door when an animatronic is there, the laughter of Freddy as he moves to your office on the right, and an empty stage at the Pirate Cove camera letting you know that Foxy is making a dash towards your office on the left, that any sense of panic, anxiety, or fear for such a noted horror game actually creates calm for the gamer. In fact, one of my contentions in this essay is that Five Nights at Freddy's is one of the most calming experiences I have ever had in gaming, which is ironic given the game's main feature is jump scaring you to a game over screen. As far as how best to beat the game in one sitting, I would agree that the majority of fans that the original Five Nights at Freddy's is best played on a PC with a mouse and keyboard, using the mouse to pull up the monitor and down conveniently while being able to click on individual cameras, and it really is a shame that FNAF 1 has not been ported for Mac computers. Literally every time I try to play FNAF 1 on Steam through Whiskey or Wineskin, it kept glitching or the frames kept dropping. For some reason when downloading FNAF 1 to play on Whiskey, it comes as a URL and not an exec file, and I can't mess with the compatibility settings when I run it, which results in this slow frame rate, as you can tell from the speed of the desk fan, as well as taking too much time to check the lights on each side. Nevertheless, when I usually play FNAF 1 with a working computer with Windows, I like to wiggle my mouse in a circle near the bottom of the screen to get a quick up and down motion with my monitor, which is useful for keeping Foxy at bay. However, as much as FNAF 1 is ideal to play with a mouse given its point and click mechanics making it easier to skim through the cameras when the monitor is up, the console port for FNAF 1, I must say, is surprisingly excellent and may be the best FNAF game to play on a console for fans and casual gamers, running at a clear 60 frames per second. In fact, I managed to beat FNAF 1 while I played my Nintendo Switch handheld and riding a stationary bike during my workouts, while my game was on mute, and I was watching New York Rangers and Knicks games. Now that's multitasking. That was a joke for how the games make you multitask if you didn't get it. However, not every FNAF game is ideal for consoles involving the use of a controller. Indeed, the very next installments, FNAF 2 and FNAF 3, show their limitations for console play. Especially the latter game, when going through the cameras to check on Springtrap is essential to beating each night, and especially when it comes to implementing secret codes to access the minigames to get the game's good ending. So playing on PC is the preferred way to go for these games due to the lack of a mouse to click on cameras when the monitor is pulled on your controller, thus making you rely on your left joystick to move between cameras as I was doing on the Nintendo Switch controller. And it can be an issue if you're skimming through cameras and have to check cameras 1C and 4B, which takes longer on a controller than it does when clicking your mouse. Anyway, moving to historical gaming comparisons for a moment, it's important to keep in mind just how different the original Five Nights at Freddy's game was for its time in comparison to other horror games. Alien Isolation, which would release a mere 2 months after the original Five Nights at Freddy's, and would receive plenty of critical acclaim, as well as becoming another favorite go-to game for streamers and gamers looking to get a good jump scare, played out as your typical first-person horror game, while also putting more emphasis on stealth gameplay and punishing the player for making too much noise and or celebrating too early, when thinking you finally got away from the alien, or maybe the working Joes. Whereas with Five Nights at Freddy's, the tension comes because you are stuck in your office and bound to your desk, helpless and unable to defend yourself with any weapons except for the doors and monitor. Whether this is because you are mandated to stay there due to company policy, or if you are feeling paranoid and don't want to leave, regardless, this unique way of gaming made it feel distinct from your typical run and gun and duck when necessary game a la Resident Evil or System Shock 2. To paraphrase one notable YouTuber, Five Nights at Freddy's plays out as a completely defensive game, where you have to defend yourself against the intruding animatronics, unlike first-person horror games where you play on the offensive, shooting and killing threats while running, crouching, ducking, and hiding. In fact, and this is going to sound very bizarre, but bear with me for a moment, the game that Five Nights at Freddy's reminds me the most of isn't Alien Isolation, Amnesia, Limbo, or The Seventh Guest. And it's not even a horror game. No, it's the 2013 point-and-click game by Lucas Pope entitled Papers, Please. Yes, really, Papers, Please. A game in which you play as an immigrations inspector working for the fictitious communist country Arstotzka and have to check the documents of citizens and immigrants to keep your family well fed and safe, while being forced to make moral decisions which might cost you an early ending. It might seem bizarre to make this comparison between Five Nights at Freddy's and Papers, Please beyond both of these games involving desk jobs, since the latter game has more overt political elements beyond the gameplay, i.e. the issue of immigration and how countries deal with immigrants, and although this game is based on the Eastern Bloc, however realistic it may or may not be, I would say an immigration game like this would be more applicable to how the United States treats immigrants at the southern border. However, I think the biggest comparison between the two games, besides putting the player in tense situations, is how Papers, Please becomes easier for players to get into a rhythm if they know what they are doing, and making decisions like it's second nature. Some would say this is a flow state. Likewise with the original Five Nights at Freddy's, which, while lacking the real-world politics in Papers, Please, still forces the player to get used to a pattern like light, pull up the monitor, light, and repeat, and maybe tweak with this pattern a little as the week goes by, or maybe not. This is a point I always go back to, how some games get players into a flow, but being able to succeed on most nights in FNAF 1 is one of the most calming experiences in gaming, as long as you can anticipate animatronics coming at the door. Anyway, each night from 1 to 5 involves the 4 main animatronics building up their AI levels, sometimes by the hour. Night 1 serves as an introduction for the player to get used to the light and door buttons, as well as to pull up the monitor with either your mouse at the bottom of the screen, or your left button on your controller. I find the former method easier, but more on that later. However, despite the seemingly calm introduction, come 2 PM and past that, you might be surprised if you're checking the cameras around the dining area, backstage, or supply closet, and Bonnie the Bunny is hanging around, and maybe you're checking the lights and Bonnie arrives at your door to say hi, this being your cue to not let him in and to close the door. As a side note, if you unlock the custom night on FNAF 1 and set the 4 animatronics AI level to 0, it does not mean that the animatronics won't move. In fact, as I was capturing footage of each camera and some Easter eggs for this essay, I was surprised to see Bonnie on the move and my power too low to complete the night as I was too busy trying to capture a moment with this big yellow fella. And with each night, the animatronics will be testing your ability to conserve power, and it might be best to think of playing this game like you're trying to grow a sixth sense. How loud should the sound of Bonnie or Chica's footsteps be before checking the hallway light? How many seconds will it take in between an empty Pirate Cove stage and Foxy popping his head out from the curtain? And do I keep Freddy on the main stage in night 5, or do I let him walk towards the east hallway corner and hold him there? Of course, no FNAF playthrough is complete without attempting the game's ultimate challenge, 420 mode, before 1020 and 5020 modes in FNAF 2 and UCN respectively. We're not quite there yet. In preparing a plan for how to achieve that 3rd star on the menu, I tried to build myself up to 420 and play Night 7 repeatedly by tweaking each of the animatronics AI level before doing the final challenge, trying out different strategies and seeing ways as to how I could manage my power and react when it's necessary to use the lights, doors, and monitors. Bonnie and Chica's paths are predictable, but much faster at a 20 AI level. Like, one time in Night 7, Bonnie came to my door, I shit you not, 3 times before 1 AM, which is a power killer, and Foxy's patience in between you pulling up the monitor and down is thinner than ever. And don't even get me started on keeping Freddy at camera 4B. To help ease your way to finally achieving this, you could employ cheats from your menu, specifically the radar cheat, to help you get used to their paths, but really you shouldn't be using the cheats even if they're there for free on console. Today, many gamers have completed 420, and FNAF YouTubers such as Ambience and Kevin have provided helpful video guides for how to beat 420. I should also note that since it's not possible to speedrun Five Nights at Freddy's unless you want to enable a certain cheat in the menu before playing, gamers have tried their hand with this cool way of gameplay called green running. The goal of a green run in FNAF 1 is to conserve power in the most extreme way possible, by hardly pressing the door and light buttons, and especially keeping ears close to the sound cues and various tip-tap footsteps Bonnie and Chica make, as well as not checking the monitor on Freddy until a certain amount of laughs. In fact, one user in particular was able to achieve a 420 with 26% power left. Jesus Christ. Given I'm a little too cautious when it comes to checking in on Foxy, there ain't no way I'm playing this on Switch. Mind the double negative in that last sentence. So that's the gameplay. Now let's move on to one of the aspects of this game that's held up incredibly well, not just for FNAF games, but in video games history as a whole. In my previous video essay on Dave the Diver, I try to make a point about the importance of sound design and music to enhance the experience of playing video games and how sound design really puts the player in the environment. And in the case of Five Nights at Freddy's, the game's sound design enhances the playing experience by creating a cold, haunting atmosphere, which is unforgettable when compared to the environments in FNAF 2, 3, and Sister Location. Even if you aren't into the game's loud and streaking Jumpscare sound effect, the game's 3 ambient background tracks for the fan, the environment, and the animatronic warning siren don't scream out danger, danger, but rather, the sound design and mixing of these 3 tracks really makes you feel alone in an environment in which you're the only living, breathing thing who isn't mechanical. It's another example how the best video games, like BioShock, are able to build their worlds not just visible to us, but make use of our senses even if we're just sitting in front of a screen. Worlds like BioShock's Rapture and BioShock Infinite's Columbus are filled with little details like cigarettes, posters, and books, but relevant to this section, Being that these worlds are underwater and up in the air, respectively, their environment feels complete with atmospheric sound design, including a combination of layered ambience and unique sound effects to make you feel like you're surrounded by the deep, cold ocean, complete with the sound of whales singing far back or up high in a, let me be honest here, pretty pasty white paradise. But relevant to the horror genre of gaming, Alien Isolation borrows heavily from its major influence, the original 1979 classic sci-fi horror film, to pay tribute to what made the film a classic while forcing the gamer to watch every noise they make and to pay attention in front or behind, and it certainly helps that it borrows the beeps and sounds from the late 70s, 80s era, even if this is supposed to be a future setting. Five Nights at Freddy's, while not exactly an ideal first-person gaming experience, has a near-pitch perfect combination of sound design, with ambient background noise and sound effects coming from the animatronics to complement the game's artwork and the establishment to create a creepy atmosphere, despite the game's obvious lack of a big budget and funding, making it necessary to develop this game with stock sound effects, yet every sound and music cue is used effectively. The very first night you're working, you're immediately greeted to two layers of ambient sounds which are mixed well. The office fan, which you see at your desk and get used to its odd loop knowing that there's no way to turn it off, yet it's a subtle way of telling the gamer to keep their cool as the week progresses. And this dark ambient noise, which is perhaps my favorite ambient track out of all the ambient tracks in the games, minus for the FNAF 4 ambience. This track is called Cold Presence B, an alternate take of the song which was used for the game's trailer, and while that song was more thriller-oriented, the version of the song used during gameplay makes you feel cold in a world which should otherwise make others happy when it's not night. But there's another ambient noise that goes from faint to tension building, and that is the warning ambience when the animatronics are closing in on your office. The track is called Eerie Ambience Large Scale _MV005 according to the game files, and according to the game's code, depending on which animatronic is closing in on your office, this ambient siren will either get louder or lower. This warning track is a little less obvious of an alert when compared to the warning sounds in FNAF 2 and 3. Like, FNAF 2's is like a beaming alert to flash your light, and 3 is letting you know that Springtrap is a little too close to your office. Or maybe it's a false alarm and you should keep your monitor up for Phantom Freddy. Anyway, the three tracks in FNAF 1 are chilling, but strangely, they're also very calming, unusual for a game that is in the horror genre, to the point where if you were really working the night shift at the pizza place, you'd be tempted to fall asleep until 6 AM. In fact, do keep this in mind when I talk about a certain animatronic who makes a certain sound. But during the writing of this script, I would spend an hour or two on the couch taking a nap listening to Cold Presence B, which put me to sleep, reminding me of how much experience I had built in playing the game and relying on my reflexes and reaction time, when all of a sudden I would hear this whispering robotic sound effect that was traumatizing during my gameplay, and I immediately jumped up from my couch waking from the nap. Again, more on that sound effect later. Which reminds me, then there's the individual sound effects, the monitor and static sounds which come when you pull the monitor, along with the camcorder sound effect which comes once you start looking at the cameras. These camera sounds are ASMR to my ears that mix well with the ambient background, though the noise coming from the light hardly makes a peep. The door closing and opening is loud, though this is way before you had to pay some mind to the noise level when playing Pizzeria Simulator or UCN. I do think that the effect that plays when Bonnie and Chica are at the door is a little much, but regardless, it's impressive how it all sounds considering many of these sounds are stock effects, yet are used so effectively. So, Five Nights at Freddy's 1 is not a traditional game with a straightforward start-to-finish story, a character arc we can empathize with due to the lack of character development, or really a satisfying conclusion other than the pleasure of getting through 7 days of security work before getting fired. Never mind the poor pay the pizza place pays, more on that later. And it really does suck that we never get to relate with Mike Schmidt all that well. At least at first glance. Yes, I know. So I would argue that Mike Schmidt isn't the most important character of the game. No, the real important character of the game is the one who isn't breathing or doesn't roam at night, yet has the most interesting story, the pizza place. Looking at your desk, presumably you or someone else ate before getting your hands dirty with monitor checking from 12 to 6, and you see a few other monitors you can't check which are turned off. Well, that is unless Foxy does his entrance sometimes. There's also a celebration poster to the left of your desk with Bonnie, Freddy, and Chica, and also resembles the images you see when you input the AI levels in Custom Night, and a few drawings on the right made by kids visiting the place, yet you don't know if they were made for the security guards or not. By the way, the stories depicted in the pictures have no relevance to the story other than background decoration. You may be staying here for a couple of nights, but that spiderweb at the bottom of the desk is as neglected as the wires hanging in each hall next to your hallway. From checking your monitor, every camera in every room in Freddy Fazbear's Pizza tells a story of a decrepit working environment that barely manages to hang on, making you wonder how this place keeps itself open to welcoming children during the daytime hours, despite the establishment's reputation. From looking at the dining area and main stage at first glance, the pizzeria doesn't look too shabby. Sure, the animatronics look worn, but not to the point that they need repair, save for Foxy at Pirate Cove, which could be written off as a minor inconvenience before learning more about this place. And the dining area looks like it's about to host another birthday party, like its usual business. But then you get to the backstage area, aka the last place you want to end up in, and it's filled to the brim with empty animatronic heads and an endoskeleton, aka Endo 1, and if you're lucky you might catch not one but 2 Easter eggs when flipping the monitor. The west hallway light is barely hanging on, and it's amazing how a certain animatronic can blend in with the shadows. No relation here. The east hallway has posters of Freddy, Bonnie, and Chica hanging up, and they seem to be golly. For now. And then we get to the rules for hanging out at Freddy Fazbear's at the east hall corner above the sheets and crumpled paper, which I'll read right now for those listening. 1. Don't run. 2. Don't yell. 3. Don't scream. 4. Don't poop on the floor. 5. Stay close to mom. 6. Don't touch Freddy. 7. Don't hit. 8. Leave before dark. Well, we most definitely know the animatronics violate at least 2 or 3 of these rules. I don't think I've ever heard of an animatronic taking a shit before. But don't touch Freddy? Why? He's already got 2 handprints on his head, so what's his deal? Also, why assume a kid is going to be brought to a pizza place by their mom? Do dads hate the taste of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza? Okay, so one last minor note before moving on, which is worth mentioning, is this. I am going to have to spend an entire chapter explaining my thoughts on the reception of FNAF fan games and why I'm not particularly fond of spending time playing them compared to the original FNAF games. But the unofficial deluxe version of FNAF 1 is a nice little modded update to the original game and plays about 95 to 99% the same as the original game from nights 1 to 5, and plays really well on Mac at 60 frames per second if you can run it through wineskin like I did. Of course, you need to have a bought copy of FNAF 1 before playing, but one detail that was improved in this mod of FNAF 1 that I think works better than the original game is how the office light flickers as you're playing compared to the steady light in the original. It's a detail which I didn't notice when I first played through the deluxe edition during night 1, until I noticed the door and light buttons on each side seemed to have less light on them for a split second, and I thought, isn't that appropriate for this game's environment? If only there was an official remaster of this game which took note of this detail. Regardless, it adds a nice little touch to the horror setting of this game. However, Five Nights at Freddy's is not just a horror game, it's also a mystery, but it's a game with not just one mystery. In fact, the game throws at you a number of mysteries, which, while they aren't solved here, and that's probably for the better in my opinion, until we get to future games which would explain the lore, these unsolved questions only add tension as the player panics while reaching the end of the week. To summarize a number of these mysteries, we'll start with the mystery as to what happened to the missing children that are mentioned in several newspaper clippings, aka an Easter egg which counts as 4 different eggs, or articles. My boomer ass eyes weren't able to read the text from my TV, so I had to check the Freddy files to see what these news clippings were reporting. Kids vanish at local pizzeria, bodies not found. 2 local children were reportedly lured into a back room during the late hours of operation at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza on the night of June 26th, while video surveillance identified the man responsible and led to his capture the following morning. The children themselves were never found and are presumed dead. Police think that the suspect dressed as a company mascot to earn the children's trust. 5 children now reported missing, suspect convicted. 5 children are now linked to the incident at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, where a man dressed as a cartoon mascot lured them into a back room. While the suspect has been charged, the bodies themselves were never found. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has been fighting an uphill battle ever since to convince families to return to the pizzeria. It's a tragedy. Whoever said this quote at the bottom, the article doesn't say. Was it the CEO? Nobody knows. Local pizzeria threatened with shutdown over sanitation. Local pizzeria Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has been threatened again with shutdown by the health department over reports of foul odor coming from the much-loved animal mascots. Was that supposed to be from the much-beloved? Police were contacted when parents reportedly noticed what appeared to be blood and mucus around the eyes and mouths of the mascots. One parent likened them to reanimated carcasses. Local pizzeria said to close by year's end. After a long struggle to stay in business after the tragedy that took place there many years ago, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza has announced that it will close by year's end. Despite a year-long search for a buyer, companies seem unwilling to be associated with the company. These characters will live on in the hearts of children. These characters will live on. CEO. What's the name of the CEO giving the quote here? Nobody knows again. Putting aside the obvious spelling and grammar mistakes in these 4 clippings, and hey, look, while I love the writing process more than video editing, I am not the best at the written word myself. These newspaper clippings, when they're screenshot and put together in the appropriate order, tell a story. We read that a number of children disappeared and the security camera supposedly caught the guy doing it, but the bodies were never found, and thus the establishment is threatened into shutdown due to health department violations, which it eventually does. When exactly they are dated, the clippings don't say, but we know that Freddy Fazbear's did try to find someone to help salvage the establishment, which led to a year-long failed search. Of course, the sections which might get the reader's attention is what's going on with the animatronics after the children went missing. Mainly the blood and mucus around the eyes and mouths of the mascots, and how they're reanimated carcasses. Could the missing children be in the animatronics? Maybe stuffed in the suits the same way you're stuffed in if you get jump scared? Say, what about the other security guards who worked at Freddy Fazbear's before you did? Could the blood and mucus be theirs? Either one of these possibilities might explain the odor coming out of them, which is mentioned on your pink slip after the custom night 7, or maybe Mike Schmidt just doesn't know how to shower. Also, what is up with this wall here at the East Hall? Usually there's posters of 3 animatronics, but on a rare occasion you might see these 3 bizarrely drawn out little crying ghouls here replacing the posters of Bonnie, Freddy, and Chica. Is Five Nights at Freddy's really a game about quirky animatronics on free roam mode? Or is FNAF 1 a ghost story, or a metaphorical ghost story involving a creepy, haunting, nostalgic memory that you wish was more positive, but it ended up badly? And why do I get this jumbled picture of Freddy in the West Corner office when all I want to do is see the yellow bear? Seriously, why does it take so long to get the yellow bear to show up? And what about the various instances where you see the phrase, "It's me"? Or, and probably the most frequent scenario in which you see it, when you see flashing images of Freddy and Bonnie for a few moments as you're playing as early as night 1. Is this an hallucination from zoning out at the night shift job? What does this phrase even mean? Why does the sign at Pirate Cove change to "It's me" sometimes? No, Foxy, your name is Foxy, not me. And back to that East Hall wall, once again, it changes sometimes to "It's me." What does it even mean? Is this the killer who killed the children speaking to Mike Schmidt? Are the children trying to speak to him? Or at least one of the kids? Or could it be, and hear me out, that "It's me" means that the killer is you? Which sounds really stupid. And anyone who thinks that, and who believed it at the time 10 years ago, didn't know what they were talking about. In fact, it's especially as stupid as saying the knight in Hollow Knight is the Pale King. But that's foreshadowing for another time in the near future. Obviously, these mysteries and the questions brought up have been explained, or for non-fans and haters, negated by the lore, or at the very least have their theories, from plausible to nonsensical, But you have to understand, at the time the game was released 10 years ago, the emerging FNAF community was becoming incredibly engaged in what was going on in the game and all of the little details depicted in the game's pizzeria environment, which is a compliment to these gamers being more observant than you might think. But to be honest, a major problem with having to revisit these games, and one which I will have to repeat when necessary, is that the theorizing threatened to drag this series' legacy, since every little thing and cranny needed some overtly complicated theory or explanation. For example, which of the missing children drew the crayon drawings in your office and what do they mean? And it certainly didn't help that whoever was in charge of creating this universe didn't seem like the type to give a concrete explanation as to what was going on. Nevertheless, at least in the first game, there is room for ambiguity, and FNAF 1 wasn't interested in handing out easy answers and leaving the mystery open for gamers to figure out, and, more importantly, be focused on setting a grim tone and getting players into a rhythm when playing the game, preferably with a mouse of course. And with all of these positive qualities laid out, we can move on to explaining and dissecting the characters of Five Nights at Freddy's. So, I am titling this chapter, The Characters, rather than The Animatronics, not only because, well, human characters are involved in the game, and to an extent, the series, though I will say, and keep in mind, not all the human characters are fully developed, but also, the original Five Nights at Freddy's has 4, if not 5, of the best character designs in the entire series, with each of their own quirks and behaviors. And yes, before anyone says anything, I am fully aware as to why the animatronics act the way they do, but I am going to pretend to let the mystery be, continue to act like it's August of 2014 and we don't fully know for sure what's up with them. The only negative about this chapter is that I won't be doing a portion for the playable character Mike Schmidt, since I already explained my gripes with this character earlier in this essay, if you can even call him that, at least in this game. Yes, again, I know, but the lore, don't care for now. Anyway.
I like to hot all day.
Our first animatronic we will discuss, and the first one which you will likely encounter during night 1, is Bonnie the bluish, purplish, purple people eater-ish bunny rabbit, sometimes shown with his guitar, which looks like a Gibson Flying V, appropriate considering these characters originated in the 80s. Anyway, despite what you may have heard, Bonnie is arguably the most adorable out of the core 4 animatronics in the original game, despite at times looking and acting like the most threatening. Maybe it's because of the red bow tie which goes well with his face and pointy long ears, or perhaps it's because I just finished playing Animal Well before the summer started, and I managed to collect all 16 bunnies and now I'm in a good mood. Of course, you shouldn't let his good looks and his sweet guitar fool you, as he will catch you if you are not paying attention to his movements. Bonnie begins his route to your office from the main stage in the dining area with Freddy and Chica, before moving past the dining area tables and into the backstage room, an area which hopefully you won't get used to visiting. And here you will see a naked endoskeleton, along with a few unused animatronic heads. Bonnie will stop by here occasionally on his route, and sometimes on your camera, you'll get this rare image of Bonnie, but his eyes are blackened as he's close to the camera. However, the supply closet is the room which is Bonnie's signature hideout, and where he looks his creepiest standing there still, doing nothing but waiting to pounce, compared to how he acts at camera 2B near your office at the corner of the West Hall, mumbling robotic noises as his endo jar opens wide. Unfortunately, Bonnie's jump scare is one of the easiest to defend yourself against, along with Chica, as you will know he's there to say hi if you click on your left hallway light, and his head's there accompanied by this sound effect, which you can respond to by shutting the left door, and it helps to know when he's about to arrive if your ears are good at hearing and you hear his pit-pat footsteps, to borrow a term from YouTuber Kevin. It might get annoying to wait until he finally leaves during the first few nights, as he has the tendency to stay in the hallway for a bit, as you can tell from his shadow in the hallway, and keeping the door light will consume power, but he'll leave eventually, and this gets better in later nights as he leaves quicker, but since his AI level gets higher along along with the other animatronics, expect him to stop by more. So, not only is Bonnie in FNAF 1 an undisputed S-tier animatronic design, at least for me, but Bonnie also has, undisputably, the best variations on his animatronic out of the core 4, as the series progressed. Sure, his withered form in FNAF 2 may have been a little much, what with having only one arm and without most of his face, sort of like when he took his own face off in the FNAF 1 trailer. But his toy version in that same game makes you say, isn't that the cutest little wabbit you've ever seen? His nightmare form in FNAF 4 is decent compared to the other nightmare animatronics, which are uneven in design and go from excellent to over the top. Really? Does he really need a mouth where his stomach is? Bon Bon in Sister Location is funny, at least for me, but it's hard to judge a design like this when Bon Bon is Funtime Freddy's puppet, and without Freddy, he's, half a design, I don't know. Rockstar Bonnie and Pizzeria Simulator and Ultimate Custom Night is cool looking and has his guitar back, despite the unnecessary rosy cheeks. And while there is a lot I could say about the quality of Security Breach, one thing I will say is that his glam rock Bonnie version, at least judging from this sweet illustration, rocks so fucking hard that it pisses me off that he's not an animatronic who chases you. Instead, he's replaced by Monty Montgomery Gator. Because you get it, Montgomery is a city in Alabama and Bama's got alligators. So Bonnie in this game looks too beat up and tattered when you see him, but then again, this is the least of Security Breach's problems. But to get back on point, Bonnie didn't get the chance to jump scare me until an attempt at 420, and I was stupid enough to do the method of cam spamming until I got to 95% power, not paying attention to the footsteps before his teeth wanted to chomp me up. And sometimes during my late game runs in nights 5 to 7, Bonnie would catch me off guard as I'm flipping the monitor and forgetting to shut the door when the light shows he's there. It goes to show you that 5 Nights at Freddy's 1 is testing your reaction time. Of course, I'm not so much scared by Bonnie as I am flattered he would stop by for a brief interruption to my rhythm. In fact, I have absolutely no idea why anyone in their right mind would think Bonnie the Bunny would look scary or threatening. They would have to be a real knucklehead to think that way. The second animatronic we'll discuss is the yellow big bird, no relation, named Chica the Chicken, the backup singer for the band who wears a bib that says, "Let's eat," and who is usually accompanied by her cupcake named, well, Cupcake, though not when she's roaming around at night or when she jump scares you. Of course, there's that cupcake in front of you at your office desk that just stares at you all night long. Chica has more or less the same function in the game as Bonnie, except she walks and tries to attack you from the east hallway, starting her path from the main stage in the dining area and moving to the kitchen, the restroom, and to the hallway in its corner. What's worse is that as she is on the move to your office, you can't see Chica if she is in the kitchen, as the kitchen's camera is disabled, but you will know she's there when she's toying around with the pots and pans, as indicated by the preceding sound effect. Do androids dream of electric sheep? More like, do animatronics eat before going to sleep? Anyway, I don't know whether Bonnie or Chica is more difficult to deal with in 420, since they basically function the same way in the game, though I do find myself dealing less with Chica stopping by during gameplay than I do with Bonnie. And like Bonnie, I only got jump scared by Chica during a Night 7 run, probably because I forgot to check the east hallway light indicated by this dreaded sound. Then, after pulling up and down my monitor, I got greeted by her peck and teeth. Chica's animatronic design in the first game is pretty great and almost as adorable as Bonnie, but it's not objectively the best Chica design. Toy Chica in FNAF 2 might be a little, risque for a children's toy, which is odd, though it is creepy when she roams around with her eyes blackened and her beak missing. Phantom Chica in FNAF 3 is more or less the same design as FNAF 1, except more grimy. Her design in FNAF 4 is, like most of the animatronics in that game, a little much, and deviates greatly from her OG design. Almost like whoever was coming up with the nightmare animatronics was trying a little too hard. And though she doesn't appear in Sister Location, her two designs in Pizza Simulator, Rockstar Chica, and Funtime Chica are just fine designs, nothing remarkable. And then there's her Security Breach design, which, what? I said I wasn't going to say much about that game in this video, so leave it at that. So overall, Chica's original design, like the rest of the animatronics in this game, have never been topped, with one notable exception. Next is the FNAF's fan base's favorite pirate, whom no one could ever underestimate his cunning, Foxy the Pirate Fox, maybe only the second or third best fox in video game history, and like any good fox, he has a hook on his hand, or paw, and he's got an eye patch, which he can flip off on his own. His eye works just fine. And sometimes you can hear his little dum-dum-dum-dum song while you're playing the game. Anyway, Foxy becomes a threat right around night 2, at least during my runs, but unlike Bonnie and Chica, Foxy does not move and make the rounds like them. As you learn on night 2, Foxy needs to be checked on at camera 1C, the camera for Pirate Cove, and rather than move from one room to another, Foxy has 4 stages before he tries to jump scare you, and all of them you will begin to recognize the more you check the camera at Pirate Cove, aka camera 1C, which the Freddy Files the Freddy Files, Jesus, says is the most important camera, which is a tip I strongly disagree with, but more on that in the next character section. The first stage of Foxy can be seen with this image here, in which the curtain is closed and the sign on the bottom says sorry out of order, either because he's not active that night and or because you're pulling the monitor on the regular. No, not that way. Please don't. The second stage is when his face pops from the curtain and he stares at the camera during your late game runs. Here, I am able to keep him in place on this stage since I have to check on Freddy using the light monitor light method. And sometimes when I think I'm keeping him at stage 1 during a night 7 gameplay, I might slip up and forget to check the monitor while keeping a door closed and inadvertently let him advance to the next stage. The third stage is the one where the tension rises. And this is the one I try my best to avoid during my late game runs. Here you can see Foxy in position like he's about to run, his animatronic body darkened and a clear view of his hook. You might be able to hold him off for a little, but not for long. And then we get to the fourth stage, only this time, he's not on the stage, but making his dash towards you at the West Hall, meaning you only have a few seconds to shut the door before
The pirate tries to hook you and feed you to the fishes.
So here's another thing I learned pretty late during my gameplay and a tip I had to look up. Foxy rarely ever tried to attack me, at least when I was checking on him, but when you keep the left door shut before he tries to attack, it costs 1% of power, which might not seem like much unless he tries to attack you again, and in that case he can cost you 5% of power, and then another 5% and so on. It's a risk when you don't pay attention to him at Pirate Cove, but after playing this game for hours, I think Foxy is pretty easy to deal with. Maybe a little too easy given my second full playthrough involving having to reset night 5 again and again because he kept getting to stage 3 due to me forgetting to keep up with my monitor flipping. However, during my first playthrough, I didn't even see Foxy pop his head out from nights 1 to 3. Perhaps it was because I was a little too careful with my monitor flipping, and I was able to cruise through these nights until night 4, me being dumb enough not to check the Pirate Cove camera and to see if he was ready to make a hallway dash, only to have him be the first animatronic to jump scare me. But hey, at least it didn't happen as early as night 2. Also, and this is a trick newbie gamers won't realize until later, you don't even need to have the monitor checking the camera on Foxy at Pirate Cove to keep him at bay, as any camera will keep Foxy in his place so long as you're pulling up the monitor regularly. Unlike Freddy, who needs the camera on him to keep him from moving towards your office, but more on that soon. Sometimes, however, you might come across an Easter egg on the stage, with the sign saying, "It's me," which gee, I wonder if I've seen that before and what it means. When compared to his FNAF 1 form, the designs of Foxy the Pirate Fox have been mixed, putting aside any mangled forms for the moment. Withered Foxy in FNAF 2 is fine, but for the life of me, I don't know why his voice in FNAF World has a weird accent that sounds less pirate-like. Also, having to use the flashlight, and also, even if you put Withered Foxy's AI level at 0, he will still be active at night, which is very frustrating, and is why I absolutely hate Withered Foxy, though not as much as I hate Balloon Boy. But anyway, his Phantom form in FNAF 3 is forgettable and easily the worst jump scare in that game, and is also the easiest to avoid unless you're lazy to open and close the right monitor in that game. His FNAF 4 design is actually okay considering the nightmare forms are a little much, and it's nice that his stages in the closet are a callback to the original. Funtime Foxy in Sister Location is a funny, non-binary icon for fans, and his Rockstar Foxy form in Pizza Simulator and UCN may be a little too polished. Foxy in FNAF 1, though, is just perfect for his function as an animatronic, with his worn upper body showing how he's neglected compared to the other 3 animatronics, and his metallic legs showing he can put those legs to work. Like, instead of having 2 wooden peg legs like a pirate, his legs have been replaced Terminator style, along with his pitch-perfect voice acting in UCN. I'm not sure I should even judge Roxanne Wolf for this section, since she, like Glamrock Chica, deviates so much from their original forms, and also feel like they were made for deviant artists if, that's your thing.
Now would be a good time to hold your breath.
However, the most dangerous animatronic in Five Nights at Freddy's isn't Foxy dashing from Pirate Cove looking to hook your head or Bonnie or Chica stopping by to say hello. No, it's the character on the game's cover and the franchise's main player, Slippin' Freddy, aka Freddy Fazbear, the lead singer of the quote-unquote band, which doesn't have an official name, and yet Freddy's the lead singer, complete with a black top hat, black bow tie, and black microphone. And since we are talking about the first game, I will put a lot of emphasis on the word slippin'. Because if you have ever played FNAF 1 before and got stuck on nights 4 or 5, you know Freddy Fazbear is one slippin' motherfucker of a bear, as he can either jump scare you if your power runs out and you're still sitting there in the dark hoping that the clock reaches 6 a.m. to finish the night, or if you're not paying attention to where he is on camera. While there are ways to tell if Freddy is going to give you that first jump scare if you run out of power and you hear that music box version of
Corridor March
as he stands by the left door, and you wait to see if it turns to 6 a.m. or if you end up stuffed into a Freddy suit, it's that second jump scare that gets novice gamers because most might not predict it if they haven't figured out Freddy. In the base game, Freddy becomes active right around the second half of night 3, and you will know Freddy is on the move when you hear his audible deep laughter echoing as you're trying to keep Bonnie and Chica away. What's worse for novice gamers is that they have gotten used to seeing the movements, shadows, and or silhouettes of Bonnie or Chica on the camera, getting to know their walking patterns or their pit-pat footstep sounds, and gamers can also tell whether or not Foxy is ready to dash, depending on his stage. But for newbies, the same cannot be said for Freddy as soon as he's active. Freddy can be detected on camera if you have good eyesight, and you're able to figure out his route. However, camera 4B is the key camera, and the one you should lock on as soon as you hear his laughter starting at night 3. During my initial run to beating nights 5 and 6, I was able to keep Freddy on the stage, amazingly, while holding Foxy off at the same time. But this is not an ideal strategy, especially for 420 mode. It is the consensus amongst gamers that the ideal strategy to keep Freddy from getting at your door is by keeping the monitor at camera 4B, the last camera to your right, which might seem counterproductive since it's too close to your office, but given that most gamers on first playthrough might take Freddy for granted since he stays on the main stage for the first 2 nights and a good part of night 3, if you're good with monitor flipping and are able to do your light monitor light strategy effectively, he'll almost never jump scare you. This is why the pattern of left light monitor, right light monitor is so important to practice, especially in 420 mode when power management matters a lot. Otherwise, if you don't know what you are doing and aren't paying attention to his laughs and camera movements, you might think you're safe in your office with a door or 2 shut until you hear this mumbling robotic whisper in your ear. Forget the jump scare sound. This sound effect is the one I dread the most, because it's the sound which tells me I royally fucked up. In fact, going back to a note about sound effects for a moment, while I was taking a nap in between writing this script and other things, I had on the FNAF 1 office ambience playing on YouTube, playing calming, soothing ambience until at some point I heard this. And my fucking head jerked up, remembering all of those failed nights 4, 5, and 7s. Arguably, it's scarier than the actual jump scare sound effect for this game, because in the case of Freddy, you might assume it's one of the other animatronics rambling incoherently and shaking their head while looking at the camera, but this effect is actually two sound effects combined and distorted, with the rambling robotic animatronic noise being one, and this soft human whispering.
Wild whispering.
And all of this is before the unexpected. To me, this is the best jump scare in the whole game, and it's even better than his power outage jump scare. It's right in your face, the whole room shakes as he gets closer just like the others, except this time, it's far more uncomfortable, and his eyes look somewhere between his jolly light blue eyes and those black dead eyes he gives as he's staring at you at camera 4B. Although, to this day, I'm still wondering if Freddy Fazbear also has the power to remove the doors and light buttons by the door when he jump scares you. That's never been explained to me. Freddy Fazbear in FNAF 1 has the best Freddy animatronic design out of the whole cast, and no other Freddy design in the rest of the series tops it. Toy Freddy in FNAF 2 is funny, especially with his voice lines in later games, but it removes the scare factor when he's got this voice that sounds like he's about to sing a pretty bad version of I Love You, while complaining that Mr. Hugs got him again. And although Withered Freddy in FNAF 2 is connected to the original Freddy in FNAF 1 like the other animatronics, I feel like the scariest part about his design is whether he's gonna jump scare me or just eat me with his mechanical teeth. Phantom Freddy is forgettable in FNAF 3, Nightmare Freddy is overdone, Funtime Freddy in Sister Location is whatever, and Molten Freddy is unique, though I wouldn't necessarily call it an ideal Freddy animatronic, since it's really an amalgamation of other animatronics. And while there's a lot to say about security breach, for the life of me, I don't know why Glamrock Freddy sounds more like a wise sage than a glamrock star about to take me on a mythical journey. If there is one major flaw with Freddy Fazbear as the mascot of the series, it's that, despite the franchise bearing his name, no pun intended there, Freddy becomes not only less significant in future games, but also less of a threat. Take Sister Location for example, in which Funtime Freddy, while being the cover animatronic, is only a threat when you have to deal with the circuit breakers during Night 2. See also Pizzeria Simulator. Yes, Rockstar Freddy is an animatronic you could buy, but does Molten Freddy really count as a Freddy? And as for Glamrock Freddy, well, he's mostly a guy for our little hero named Gregory. And it's funny to be talking about Freddy Fazbear because in real life, bears, as in the wild animals, do not scare me. Take it from someone who regularly goes on hikes in the woods and comes across black bears grazing grass, sitting around, and hanging with little cubbies. In fact, I have grown up to love bears. In fact, you can say that I love seeing and checking in on bears in the wild. Seeing is how I know how to get along with them safely to give them space. Black bears, brown bears, grizzly bears, polar bears, panda bears. I love wearing this Volcom shirt with a grizzly bear on it while working out and then checking the bar afterwards. Even the little colored bear designs on Grateful Dead merchandise. And I even have a little graduation bear sitting on top of my writing desk as I write this script. I guess that's why I can't be scared of Freddy. Of course, he's not the only bear in town. Or, not a town, a pizzeria to be exact. Yes, I know it's commonly referred to by another name, and yes, there's a lot more to his animatronic and how he plays into the lore, but Yellow Bear is the original name for this character according to the game files, and we'll get to all of that about this bear for another time. Anyway, the assumption gamers might have after beating the game is that there are only 4 animatronics to deal with, seeing as how there is only 4 to customize for Night 7, and 9 times out of 10, that is the experience for gamers. However, if you are lucky and you flip your monitor and change your camera to the West Hall corner camera, you have a very small chance of seeing the Freddy poster displayed changed to what seems to be a yellow version of Freddy, without eyes, or maybe they're black, followed by the laughter of a child, which is, amazingly, the same laughter used to make Freddy's laugh as he moves across the hall, albeit the pitch is low for Freddy. You are greeted to a large yellow bear sitting in your office, his eyes blackened and his limbs dead-like. This bear will disappear from your office if you flip your monitor. Otherwise, keep staring at it and do nothing, and the yellow bear will crash your game, being greeted by a slowed down, distorted version of the Jumpscares sound effect from this game with this close-up. In fact, you have more chances to see this jumbled poster of Freddy than you do of the yellow bear, and yeah, it kinda pisses me off that I keep flipping the cameras, even on custom night with every animatronic at 0, and I still can't get this big fella to show up sitting in my desk to tell you what I am talking about and how to summon him. Or them. Ooh. And as many first-time FNAF gamers know, you could just enter 1987 for each of the animatronics AI level on Night 7, and it would flash that bear once and bring you back to the menu, and leave you with more questions than answer because remember, this yellow Easter egg bear has been the subject of much debate and theorizing for years, all starting from the game's initial release. Who or what is this yellow bear? Why does he teleport into your room instead of being in free roam mode at night like the others? Is it some sort of bear god? Is it a ghost, an hallucination from working so late at night? Was this the animatronic that did the bite of 87, or is it a red herring? Is this even a shade of yellow, mid-yellow, or is it gold? I don't know. How yellow is it? How gold is it? Is it yellow gold? And round we go. Where this conversation is going, nobody knows. Let the mystery be, I guess. As I said at the beginning of this chapter, one of the big issues with Five Nights at Freddy's 1 is Mike Schmidt's character, or lack thereof, mostly relegated to sitting at a desk from 12 AM to 6, and us not being able to learn more about his backstory and character, putting aside the film for a moment, and in an establishment where the only beings are mechanical, to have someone who we can relate to. Thankfully, there is a human in the game who you get to know, briefly, and he only shows up in voice only. At the beginning of Night 1, and for each night up to Night 5, the office phone will ring and you will have the option to mute the voicemail or listen. Side note, I don't know how this works. A call is coming in, but this is clearly a voicemail, whatever. This guy on the messaging machine is Phone Guy, and you will know it's him when he greets you with his signature. Phone Guy is there to be your guide, and to not only give you advice on how to navigate your new security job, but also provide some historical info regarding the pizza place. This includes giving basic advice which will help you figure out how not to get jump scared, like being able to conserve power and knowing when to use the lights and doors, and to also check in on Foxy at Pirate Cove. Some of his advice ends up being red herrings, like staying still in your seat. I feel like that's more applicable when you only have 3% power left and you know Foxy's not going to attack you last time you checked Pirate Cove. See also, knowing that it doesn't matter if you have the monitor closing in exactly on Pirate Cove, since Foxy will stay in place if you pull the monitor regularly no matter which camera you're checking. For all of the Five Nights at Freddy's series faults and flaws, and in a world where the human characters are less fleshed out and less animated than the animatronics, which will become more of an issue as this series progressed, Phone Guy might be my favorite human character in this whole saga, and has the best arc, which we can get to diving more when we discuss future games and future episodes. Sometimes I just like listening to the FNAF 1 calls while finishing off paragraphs for this essay, just so I have something to listen to. Hell, I don't even bother muting the calls when I start the game again at Night 1.
I know it can be a bit overwhelming, but I'm here to tell you there's nothing to worry about. You'll be fine.
So, little sidebar for a moment, and the issue of differences between the main FNAF games and fan games is going to be a recurring problem with this series as we move forward, but I have to say something about it anyway since it pertains to this character. Phone Guy is such a significantly unique and necessary part of the FNAF world that it's near impossible to try and replace him and or one-up him in the role. Case in point, this example of one of many FNAF fan games, FNAF in Real Time. I have never played this game before, and I have no interest in playing this. Why do I want to play something which looks watered down and less fleshed out compared to the original game, which has a little bit more thought? And it would be one thing if I could just ignore this fan game completely, but then there's this game's version of FNAF 1's Phone Guy, which,
Hello? Hello?
Which,
Can you hear me? I can't hear you. Okay, this has happened before, where the input on your phone isn't working.
yeah, this is bad, no disrespect, but I feel like the new Phone Guy here is pretty bad and also offensive to listen to. I mean, there really is no comparison. Even in one of the most stressful, anxiety-filled working environments ever depicted in gaming, it's a fresh breath of air to hear someone so friendly and casual, even when he knows the work involved can be dangerous or fatal. Yet, sadly, although Phone Guy would become a staple of the franchise's early run, the first game would be his last game alive. At the beginning of Night 4, Phone Guy leaves a message, saying he may not be around for much long. Not really in a panic, but more like he's calm in defeat before they barge in and kill him. The jump scare sound of the yellow bear loud on the messaging machine before it cuts the static and the message ends. The following night's message, you don't hear the sound of the Phone Guy, but the deep, robotic ramblings of one of the animatronics, with snippets of jump scare sounds from the yellow bear and the regular animatronic sounds. The robotic dialogue actually spoken backwards, which, if reversed and changed in pitch, is quoting a weird, out-of-context passage from Autobiography of a Yogi by Peiramahan Soyonogada. Jesus, I hope I got that pronunciation right. Though this has never been confirmed.
Sir, it is lamentable that mass agricultural development is not speeded by fuller use of your marvelous mechanisms. Would it not be easily possible to employ some of them in quick laboratory experiments to indicate the influence of various types of fertilizers on plant growth? You are right. Countless uses of Bo's instruments will be made by further generations. The scientist seldom knows contemporaneous reward. It is enough to possess the joy of creative service.
It's such an odd quote to put in a game about roaming, jump-scaring animatronics, especially considering, once again, this is another file whose source comes from stock effects, and yet I do wonder if it's going to have any relevance later down the road, for better or worse. So overall, I wish Phone Guy could have stuck around a little while longer, because he sounds like such a jolly guy. I was just starting to get to know him more. Why did he have to be jump scared? Which reminds me, we should probably talk about what is arguably one of the signature trademarks of this franchise, and, for better or worse, what might be one of the most contentious issues for gamers who aren't fans of the series, like myself.
Drop it.
Let's be very clear at the start of this section. I am not arguing that jump scares are completely unnecessary for art and entertainment which is in the horror genre. Jump scares are a tradition in horror cinema, but are also used in action/thriller films, which don't necessarily fit in the horror genre. So it's not surprising that as video games evolved with the ever-changing technology for which they were played on, these games would incorporate jump scares to varying degree. Now, what is and what isn't horror or scary or even an effective jump scare is a matter of subjective opinion. For example, I can specifically remember a time when I was around 3 to 5 years old, and I nearly shat my pants hearing Adolf Hitler's laughing in the third playable episode of id Software's Wolfenstein 3D as he was stomping around in a mechanical suit. See also the drowning moans of the Sub-Nagurath, the final boss of id Software's other first-person shooter classic Quake. Despite being easy to beat, the Lovecraftian imagery and noises coming out of this monstrosity was enough to give me a shiver. Also, if it weren't for jump scares, Alien Isolation wouldn't be the video game horror classic in space that it is. On the other hand, some indie games and even some major AAA games are so good at horrifying the audience that you forget these games don't have to rely on jump scares for cheap frights. Take the original Silent Hill, for example, which takes place in the fictional town named after the game, and the main character looking into the actions of a cult. While the game does not rely on jump scares, it makes up for it thanks to its horrifying imagery and terrifying turns with some of its character designs, or even the original Resident Evil. Corny it may look before the remake years later, Resident Evil still works as a haunted house story, but with zombies for you to shoot in third person, and for which this game builds suspense to show not an animal attack like in the opening cutscene, but by introducing the zombie threat as a result of the T-virus. And if you've watched my channel before, one of my go-to examples in video game history is the classic sci-fi action horror System Shock 2, which sees the game's protagonist Soldier waking up to find the attached to the hip spaceships, the Von Braun and the Rickenbacker, have been infested by a seemingly alien species calling themselves the Many and threaten to infect and control the members of the crew. While System Shock 2 does utilize some jump scares, most of the horror in the game comes from realizing the gravity of the situation, no pun intended, since this is a space game, and how and why the Many really came to be, and asking the player to question their individuality over the Many's promise of their twisted, diluted version of space communism. That term sounds cool when it's coming out of activists, not by hybrids conflicted over whether or not they should kill you. A Polish indie horror game like Darkwood is one of the grimmest gaming experiences ever, unsurprising coming out of Poland, and relies heavily on atmosphere and its brutal, grotesque imagery immediately displayed at the start of the game and going forward. Limbo's black and white palette keeps monsters like the giant spider hidden save for its sharp legs, which are merciless against the child protagonist if the player fucks up. The child's only crime being that he just wanted to see his sister. So even though it's possible to make effective, even great horror gaming without too many, if at all, jump scares, let me be generous for a moment and say Five Nights at Freddy's has the 2 best jump scares in the entire franchise, despite the first and common of these jump scares getting repetitive pretty quick for those who are just getting into the game. This isn't of course a problem if you know what you are doing, and the sound effect used when getting jump scared is successful at getting the gamer with their pants down and not being careful. Believe me, I was shocked when level 20 Bonnie started chomping his teeth in front of me, though to be honest, I wasn't so scared as I was annoyed that I would fuck up this bad and early on night 7. The sound effect is loud, abrasive, and since this is coming out of the mouths of animatronics, sounds slightly mechanical. However, it's the repetitive part of the whole jump scare business that is a symptom for why the early perception of FNAF games to non-fans was either apathetic, like myself, or of dislike. Here's the problem, and maybe some FNAF fans are willing to chime in on how they feel about this take, so bear with me. Most of the jump scares in the Five Nights at Freddy's game, not all, but most of them, are not that scary. They're either annoying, goofy, repetitive, or all of the above, especially as you're trying to progress beyond night 3 and so on in each game. I will touch base on each respective jump scare sound in future entries, but for now I will again give credit and say that the original Five Nights at Freddy's has one, if not 2, of the best jump scare sound effects, maybe even the second or third best sitting behind the 4th one, which I use for my little theme theme song at the beginning of this video essay, and for the rest of the episodes going forward. And the main FNAF 1 jump scare sound is appropriate if you know the lore and are paying attention to the mysterious details in the game, mainly the question as to what happened to the children. As known by many in the FNAF community, the source for the game's jump scare sound effect is a 1981 British sci-fi horror film called Inseminoid, or Horror Planet in the US, and I thought at first listen that this sound was a child screaming. But in fact, it's actually audio from a scene in the film, in which a woman named Sandy, having been impregnated by an alien creature, this is polite speak for she was raped, gives birth to alien twins. It's very bizarre to note that, and I had to spend time writing that out, but that's what it is. It's not a particularly good movie from what I've read. However, it should be noted that regardless of the intention behind using this effect, and from what I know, I don't think this effect was used with much thought other than the need to have a high-pitched scream effect. The sound effect does appear on a 90s CD called Soundworks, which has over 2,000 sound effects. Also, it's the same effect used for the jump scare for the yellow bear, but slowed down and the pitch lower, which is appropriate to place along with the still image of Yellow Bear's black-eyed face staring at you and half of its face on screen, and the low-pitched scream is eerie, droning, and moaning as the Yellow Bear crashes your computer, even harshly than when Bonnie and Chica are making those croaking moans if they get into your office before jump scaring you. But do these games really need jump scares to be successful? To explore this question further, we should turn to some filmmaking history, both past and present. One of my favorite writer-directors in horror film and television is Mike Flanagan, and there's a reason I quoted him at the beginning of this essay. The funny thing about that quote is that I don't think Flanagan is exactly a 100% hater of jump scares. In fact, he used jump scares effectively, and dare I say, comedically, in several of his television miniseries.
I'm not making excuses. I saw...
And they're not used for a cheap scare, and if it seems like they are, it's because it's ironic. No, the problem with employing jump scares is that a jump scare needs to feel earned, and in any setting where someone is enjoying art and entertainment, a film or video game, earning it means knowing you should have expected a jump scare to happen. Case in point, the classic 1975 Steven Spielberg directed film Jaws. You know how the film portrays a great white shark killing several people in Amityville, and yet Spielberg doesn't actually show the shark apart from the obvious fin poking out in the ocean? Well, we could expect the shark to show its face countless times when it attacked people swimming recreationally at the beach, but we don't. We only see the victims get dragged under, and blood coming up afterwards. Yet come well over an hour into the film, the 25-footer shows off his face and sharp teeth by popping up for the camera, and it's done when Chief Brody is throwing bait, an act that is so mundane for someone who lives by the ocean, and everyone's like, holy shit, and there's no music cue, and nothing signaling that the shark was ever going to show up, leading to arguably one of the greatest one-liners in film history.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
To me, and maybe to you watching this scene shows an effective and fantastic jump scare, because the film has been building up to let us see the shark come up close, but with the exception of Foxy and Freddy to use as examples for now, there's no build up to these jump scares in Five Nights at Freddy's, not even the original, which I think is the best of the series. Bonnie popping at your door to say hello along with the obligatory sound effect only to be followed by him clapping his jaw in front of you does not make it scarier. You know animatronics are going to move around in the hallway, or make a foxy dash, and unless you're hearing impaired, like unfortunately myself as I'm getting older, you can tell who is coming close and when Freddy is moving himself towards camera 4B. And sure, the design of Yellow Bear is effective at terrifying us and leaving us to fill in the blanks as to what could have happened to this empty yellow suit, but no, the Yellow Bear having a deeper pitch for his jump scare is not that terrifying. And here's a tip, Freddy fans, jump scares in this game, and for that matter, the whole series, get diminished on the scarometer if your games are going to warn people upon loading that there are jump scares in the fucking games. Like, what the fuck? You mean to tell me that one of the scariest horror gaming franchises in history is going to warn people ahead of time that they're going to get scared? Don't get me wrong, there have been warnings put out by other games before, but for jump scares in a horror game? Like, slap that warning on The Exorcist, The Shining, or The Thing. Or, I don't know, the Saw movies maybe. And it would leave me feeling infantilized a little. I have no problem with warnings, even trigger/content warnings, since people might have experienced real-world trauma like abuse, or may have had experience with self-harm, or may have known someone who has self-harmed. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about a game which, at the time, was perceived as not very scary, and for which its horror was seen as cheap. Which it kinda is, let's be honest here. Nevertheless, what is more horrifying at what should have been frightening gamers while playing Five Nights at Freddy's is what is seen and heard which doesn't need jump scares, as we went over earlier. Mainly the descriptive imagery of the piece of place, the empty corners in both halls where the animatronics aren't there, the incredible sound design, and even Slippin' Freddy's robotic whispers as he sneaks up on you. Which sounds soothing for a bit until you realize you know what's coming next, and it makes it even scarier than it sounds. So to sum up, are jump scares necessary for Five Nights at Freddy's to be scary? Not really. In fact, the over-reliance on jump scares in the FNAF games was part of why, back in 2014 to 2015, the games were dismissed by big-time gaming personalities on YouTube and mainstream gaming publications. However, at this point, the jump scares have become part of the FNAF web culture, so to speak, to the point that the jump scares in the FNAF games are far better executed than the jump scares in fan games and these viral jump scare moments. And just like all the viral moments in Alien Isolation clips on YouTube, jump scares are a big reason why so many streamers and Let's Players felt the need to try the game for themselves and get scared. Otherwise, if you know what you are doing from nights 1 to 7, you can sit back, mostly, play through the week, and reward yourself with a nice $120.50 for your work week before you get your pink slip. Whoa, wait, hold on for a moment. Only $120.50 for all of this? I think looking at that amount is worthy of its own jump scare. That's a pretty piss poor joke, but moving on. Okay, so now it's time for our first regular segment in this saga where I take the time away from primarily critiquing the FNAF game so I can dive into topics which are touched on in the games but for which the younger audience may not be fully informed on and might learn something out of these tangents. Get used to seeing these every once in a while. Also, I am not claiming expertise on any of these subjects within these tangents, including on economics, which is the main subject of this segment. Full disclosure, I did not do well in micro and macroeconomics in college, which is probably for the better, since I'm a philosophy major and I'm not a know-it-all. Like I always say, I am just another internet asshole having to explain why understanding the minimum wage in our reality and in the fictional world of FNAF helps us to understand and empathize with the predicament our main character Mike Schmidt is going through. So in the United States, and as of writing this chapter in 2024, federal workers are legally paid $7.25 an hour, so $7.25 times a typical 9 to 5 8-hour workday is $58, and $58 for a day times 5 workdays is $290 a week, not including any taxes or costs for rent, heating, electric, and water bills, etc. So this basically means if you're a minimum wage worker, you can't afford a lot of things today. Like one stop at the grocery store for 1 week's amount of food could wipe out at least half of your minimum wage earnings for a week. Now, I know what some of you in America are thinking, but wait, don't individual states have their own minimum wage laws where you could make a little more money while working? Well, yes, for example, in my home state of New York, the minimum wage is $16 in the city and in Long Island, and $15 for the rest of the state as of this writing, and in the neighboring state of fucking Jersey.
Oh!
The minimum wage is $15.13 for most workers. However, there's a problem. Assuming you're working for minimum wage, let's do some math for a moment. $15 an hour times 8 hours in an 8-hour workday is $120, which is exactly the amount of money Mike Schmidt worked for a full 5-night work week in FNAF 1, when not taking into consideration inflation. And since there's 5 days in 1 work week, $120 times 5 days equals $600 a week, not including taxes and expenses. And assuming 4 weeks makes for a month, $600 a week times 4 weeks equals $2,400 for a month. And assuming you work a full year as a minimum wage worker, $2,400 times 12 months of work equals $28,800. Again, not including taxes and other costs. And that sounds like a lot of money for a security gig if this was a security gig in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States. But the problem arises when we see that making $16 an hour in Manhattan is not enough to make a living, and forget about renting an apartment for yourself. As according to this article from 2023, average rent in Manhattan is a record $5,588. But to be making a living wage in the city, you would need to make approximately $33.31 an hour, and even that is not enough to pay for 1 month of average rent in the city. There's also another problem with this discussion, as you might have noticed if you're a fan of FNAF games. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza is not located on the East Coast. I was just using New York and fucking Jersey as examples for reference. No, according to the FNAF community, which has more or less accepted this, the pizza place is located in the great state of Utah, which has a state minimum wage of $7.25, which is significantly lower pay than both New York and New Jersey. Side note, according to the community, the exact city in Utah where all this takes place is in Hurricane, Utah, which is in Washington County. But what about inflation? Surely there's a way to prove that Mike Schmidt's paycheck is worth more than it was back in 1993. Well, according to the CPI inflation calculator, Mike's $120 check for a week of work is worth $258.58 for a full week's pay today, which is actually lower than a week's worth of minimum wage work by about $40. However, checking in on the living wage calculator, since Mike Schmidt does not have any children, at least not set of in the first game, the living wage one would make today in Hurricane, Utah is $22.46. which, considering inflation, was worth $10.33. So $10.33 times 6 hours of work per night is $61.98, and times that amount by 5 nights equals $309.90 of work if Mike Schmidt were paid a living wage, which is almost $20 more than a week's worth of minimum wage work today. But this is 1993, and is a hell of a lot more than $120. Or $120.50. Okay, so maybe I bored you with a lot of math, since, you came here for a video game critique, not a ramble about a hot topic in political discussion in America, and which is only touched upon briefly in this game, and someone in FNAF 2. But still, I gotta ask, do we even need minimum wages? Why can't we just work for a living wage as shown in our hypothetical example before? And for that matter, how do we solve intersecting issues like the wage gap between women and men in the workspace? And even further, in the event that some of us workers are fired, maybe we should advocate for universal basic income for everyone so that we can help to eliminate poverty. Like other countries in Scandinavia with strong welfare states, which is indicated by how high these countries consistently rank in lists of the happiest countries in the world. And I know what some of you might say to that last part, don't use Scandinavia as an example for your leftist propaganda or whatever to say we need to raise the minimum wage. Scandinavia is not socialist, they're capitalist countries. Stop interjecting politics into my gaming and into my Freddy Time. The reason why countries like Norway and Denmark and Scandinavia don't have minimum wages is because those countries have strong unions and they're able to negotiate their wages better than, here. And here in America, despite productivity in America increasing, the federal minimum wage has not increased since 2009. But more on productivity and hourly wages later. So you see, it's one thing to look at the horror Mike Schmidt has to deal with, not just with the quirky little animatronics, but also the working conditions and exploitation he is working under. Luckily, there once was a man who had great insight into harsh labor conditions for workers. You see this guy? This man is not Santa Claus, unfortunately. Despite, Santa Claus being the coolest guy in the world with the initials SC in his name. No, his name is Karl Marx. He was a German philosopher and political thinker massively influential in political philosophy, strongly hated by conservatives and Republican politicians who haven't read anything by him beyond the front and back cover of Communist Manifesto, and maybe hated by your parents or relatives because they watched too many Fox News clips or shared too many misleading Facebook memes. However, despite the negative image depicted by conservative and even liberal news outlets and political pundits, Marx has had a major influence in politics, history, and in relation to this chapter, economics. Specifically, even if you don't identify as a Marxist yourself, you may have heard of a term called social democracy, which is a fancy term for incorporating socialism, and there was a reason I kept bringing up Scandinavia. And also, a major reason why people became more interested in learning more about social democracy and socialism over the last decade? Well, so, in a way, Marx is Santa Claus for people like me when we want to be inspired by his political thought, and who want to think about the ways class issues affects us, and intersects in every aspect of our lives: race, age, gender, disability, what have you. Anyway, a lot of critics and non-Marxists might judge him solely by his aforementioned brief pamphlet, co-written with his colleague and friend, Friedrich Engels, entitled The Communist Manifesto, which is fine if you want an hour-long summary of some of his views and critiques. But to me, I think the most definitive writings Marx wrote pertain to Marxist economics, specifically his massive 3-volume work, Das Kapital, which painfully detailed the working conditions and labor exploitation he saw all across Europe. There's a lot of quotes and anecdotes to choose from, but I think we can summarize Marx's approach to economics with this infamous quote in the preface to Das Kapital. Perseus wore a magic cap so that the monsters he hunted down might not see him. We draw the magic cap down over our own eyes and ears so as to deny that there are any monsters. Perseus here is a reference to the Greek folk hero who chopped off Medusa's head, but whereas he attacked in stealth mode while wearing the hat, here we hide away from the flaws and failures of capitalism by pretending everything is fine. We are the lone dog sitting in a house fire saying, "This is fine." When Marx wrote this passage, he was living in England and was inviting comparisons of the economic conditions between England and Marx's home country, Germany. Another manuscript Marx wrote in 1844 entitled Wages of Labor explains what he had to say about wages at the time. Wages are determined through the antagonistic struggle between capitalist and worker. Victory goes necessarily to the capitalist. The capitalist can live longer without the worker than can the worker without the capitalist. The lowest and the only necessary wage rate is that providing for the subsistence of the worker for the duration of his work, and as much more as is necessary for him to support a family, and for the race of laborers not to die out. The ordinary wage, according to Adam Smith, is the lowest compatible with common humanity, that is, with cattle-like existence. There's a reason why it's important to distinguish between a minimum wage versus a living wage. Earning a living wage, regardless of your job, means you're able to get by, whereas with a minimum wage, you could view it as the lower and the only necessary wage rate from the worker's point of view. But for the bosses, aka capitalist class, according to Marx, is just adequate since the bosses don't have to be replaced. Even Adam Smith, the god emperor of sorts of classical economics who wrote The Wealth of Nations, was in favor of a living wage and, like Marx, would take issue with the minimum wage today, even if it were to increase, say, $15, as it would not be enough in his view. A man must always live by his work, and his wages must at least be sufficient to maintain him. They must even upon most occasions be somewhat more, otherwise it would be impossible for him to bring up a family, and the race of such workmen could not last beyond the first generation. Keep all of this in mind when we look at the relationship and growing gap between worker productivity and hourly pay. The justification for minimum wage laws is that for those on top and/or those legislating wage laws, some workers' skills are only limited to the most basic function in society, that they should only make the minimum of payment. Despite, according to the IMF or the International Monetary Fund, the goal of minimum wage laws is to boost incomes and improve the welfare of workers at the lower end of the ladder, while also reducing inequality and promoting social inclusiveness. But a problem I see with arguments for and against minimum wage laws is that these arguments make the implication that minimum wage workers might be too lazy to deserve better pay, and therefore restaurant heads can manipulate the conversation over better labor protections for workers. And this especially becomes a problem when you consider that restaurant servers in America aren't even paid the $7.25 minimum wage, but are paid a minimum tip wage of $2.13 an hour. which might seem like a big deal if you work at a place that tips well, but there's issues arising as this Jacobin article notes back in 2021 when restaurant chains were lobbying in America against raising the minimum wage. A recent study from the Center for American Progress found that workers who are paid the $2.13 federal tip minimum wage are more likely to live in poverty than tip workers in states that have eliminated the sub-minimum wage for such workers. The restaurant industry has often tried to argue that ending the tip wage will be bad for workers and ultimately reduce the amount of money they make. The argument is that customers won't tip as generously if restaurants are forced to raise the wages, or because customers won't feel like restaurant workers need their money as desperately as they do now. And look, tipping is generally seen as a common courtesy, something customers at a restaurant do without being told, as someone like myself who tips 20 to 25% knowing full well that some of these restaurant workers might not be able to make ends meet. However, relying on tipping to help balance the scales of your savings as a worker means hoping the place you work at stays afloat, and perhaps hoping the place you work at finally gets the picture and tries to help workers with their salaries. To use an example, one which I don't fully endorse, in 2021, South Park creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone, two people who lean on the libertarian conservative side of the political spectrum, bought the Mexican restaurant Casa Bonita after it had closed due to the ongoing COVID pandemic in 2020, and years after they had done a South Park episode based on the restaurant entitled, well, Casa Bonita, based on their childhood memories of the place. In 2023, however, they eliminated tipping, which might seem like it could be a problem, as some employees did take issue with the new change, and yet they raised the wages for restaurant workers to $30 an hour, which, according to the living wage calculator, is almost $5 above the amount needed to make a living for a single person. I am not a resident of Denver, Colorado, so I am not qualified to say whether or not the food is good there. And again, I can't say I truly 100% support the way this was handled, especially if you compare the wage debate here to Scandinavia. But the implication in this example is, with better wages and a balance with wages and productivity, there is a boost in worker morale. Yet it doesn't seem like any major restaurant franchise wants to give workers living wages, never mind be happy about raising the minimum wage. And, most importantly, if you really wanted to demonstrate how bad it is for workers in America, especially for restaurant workers since we're talking about a pizzeria over here, all one needs to do is to show this chart, which depicts the productivity pay gap according to the Economic Policy Institute, where, if you look at the years 1948 to 1973, the average annual growth of productivity and hourly pay were consistently tagged along with each other and the rates were somewhat the same. Yet their paths separate right afterwards, and today, while the change in productivity has grown 64.7% up to 2022, the hourly pay or compensation for workers has lagged significantly, with the rate up to 14.8% in 2022, as the authors summarize. Since the late 1970s, our policy choices have led directly to a pronounced divergence between productivity and typical workers' pay. It doesn't have to be this way. There were many years where things could have gotten better for workers, and indeed, policy choices could have been compassionate and pro-worker. Take the year, let's just throw this in and say 1987. The total economic productivity rate in 1987 was 107.2%, and the hourly pay rate was 95.9%, roughly an 11.3% difference. To put that divergence into perspective, from 1948 to 1979, the difference between total economic productivity and the hourly pay rate was 0.1%, which is pretty significant, especially considering, and this was a major knife to workers in the 1980s, but, and this factoid should always be mentioned in discussions related to the 80s and how bad the economy is today, this change happened under Ronald Reagan, so almost all the economic problems that we face right now, and even all the good stuff that came out of the New Deal era, have been either diminished or eliminated starting in the 80s. And if we want to go even further, let's take the year 1993, the year the fictional events of Five Nights at Freddy's take place. The total economic productivity rate that year was 115.2%, and the hourly pay rate was 95.3%. A difference of 19.9%, so not even Bill Clinton seemed interested in saving the workers during his first year in office. And lastly, for this section on restaurants and tipping, and this is one thing I have to emphasize again and again for people in the back, We're still in a global COVID-19 pandemic that is killing and disabling workers, and restaurant workers took the brunt of this deadly plague back in 2020 during the initial months. And even now, as we've been pretending to quote-unquote get back to normal, everyone is expected to get infected and reinfected again and again, and no avenue in business displays people being so vulnerable as minimum/tip wage workers in America, because newsflash, corporations actually don't care about your health and above all safety. Another question I feel is relevant to this discussion on wages and night shift work, like the game in discussion, even if this is taking place in a fictitious horror setting. Is Mike Schmidt's job a quote-unquote bullshit job? I don't mean to be facetious. I mean, is the security job even necessary? Why not let the animatronics roam free on their own without watching them? What if, and hear me out, they, as in all four of these guys, are the security at Freddy Fazbear's? The late great American anthropologist David Graeber proposed a theory, not bullshitting here, this is real, on quote-unquote bullshit jobs in a book aptly titled Bullshit Jobs, a Theory, which is an extension of a previous essay Graeber wrote in August of 2013. Oh, just a year off from the release of a certain game, I wonder which. And in this book, he identifies 5 categories of bullshit jobs, one of them called duct tapers. Quote, duct tapers are employees whose jobs exist only because of a glitch or fault in the organization, who are there to solve a problem that ought not to exist. Throughout this section, Graeber points to examples in modern times of jobs whose work involves cleaning up the mess of superiors or others in multiple senses, such as programmers having to do work for CEOs and writing unnecessary programming which doesn't need to happen, and how women have historically been attached to duct tape work. Wives, sisters, mothers, or daughters, in his words. But what makes Mike Schmidt's nightmare security job duct tape work, and thus a bullshit job, at least from judging the first FNAF game before this series, and before the lore progressed? Well, there's the obvious fact that the animatronics wandering at night isn't Mike's fault. Somebody or something caused this other than him, and his superior, the phone guy, or more appropriately, his colleague, can't give him a straight answer as to what is going on with them. So he has to be doing this nighttime security work not just for below minimum pay, but because somebody messed with the animatronics and now they're deadly. And yes, there's a plot hole / error in this whole fiasco you might have figured out judging from the first game. If the animatronics are so deadly and they roam around at night, then why don't they leave the pizzeria? In the series, it's established that the animatronics aren't after children. Okay, maybe not intentionally in 1 or 2 instances, but rather the adults, specifically Mike Schmidt and Phone Guy, and we have to assume others who took the security job before Mike. And there's more adults outside the pizzeria. Well, because we have to assume as well, because they shut off at 6 AM, it's useless to try and leave the pizzeria. Of course, if you know the lore, the answer is a little more complicated, needlessly to say the least. Getting back to Mike Schmidt's security work and how it's bullshit, Graeber makes a point that, hypothetically, he along with workers across the country and the world should be working less, according to a prediction by economist John Maynard Keynes, who is responsible for Keynesian economics. Earlier in the book, Graeber wrote, quote, in the year 1930, John Maynard Keynes predicted that by century's end, technology would have advanced sufficiently that countries like Great Britain or the United States would have achieved a 15-hour work week. There's every reason to believe he was right. In technological terms, we are quite capable of this, and yet it didn't happen. Instead, technology has been marshaled, if anything, to figure out ways to make us all work more. In order to achieve this, jobs have had to be created that are effectively pointless. Well, in the world of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, technology has advanced just enough for the restaurant's mascots to free roam at night, but not enough to encourage workers to stay employed, dead or alive, and the point about the failed prediction of a 15-hour work week goes back to the productivity chart a few paragraphs ago, and the gap in productivity and hourly pay. If we're seeing and playing an increasingly chaotic work week, we have to assume Mike Schmidt is being productive at his job, doing above and beyond the bare minimum. And yet, in order to make even more money, Mike Schmidt would have to overwork himself and work even more hours at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Towards the end of the book, Graeber, while he wasn't a fan of promoting policy, proposed universal basic income to help supplement the bullshit workers have to deal with. Despite UBI having been historically attached to libertarian economists like Milton Friedman, who advocated gutting the welfare state completely and replacing it with monthly UBI, there are ways to introduce UBI as a policy position even while trying to improve the crumbling social safety net in America, and maybe give a boost to that $120.50 check at the end of the game. But remember, UBI wasn't as popular or known back in 1993 compared to the latter part of the 2010s and to today. And relevant to that time, the damage inflicted upon workers due to Reagan economics can be applied to how little Mike gets paid in the end, intentionally or not. So let's stick to our protagonist Mike Schmidt and discuss whether or not he would be getting by in life with his paycheck, including the overtime on night 6. Yay, more math. According to the US Department of Labor, if the events of FNAF 1 take place in 1993, the federal minimum wage would have been $4.25 for all covered non-exempt workers, not including tip workers since Mike is not working a server job. And if we multiply that amount by the number of hours Mike works, which is 6, Mike Schmidt would get $25.50 for a full night of work, not including taxes, of course. And when multiplying one night's work of pay by 5, as in 5 nights of work, because, 5 nights you get the idea. Mike Schmidt would get $127.50 for a full 5-night work week. Again, not including taxes. But there's a problem, you might say, because Mike's paycheck he gets at the end of night 5 says that he earned $120, and if you divide that by 5 nights of work, that's $24 paid per night, and divide that by 6 hours per night is $4 an hour, which is somewhere between minimum wage and a poverty wage. So, what's up with that? Are we to assume there's some cost for any meals he doesn't get for free, and so he has to pay out of his paycheck? Or is the employer keeping the remaining $7.50? Also, for night 6, instead of the $25.50 for a 6-hour work night, Mike only gets 50 cents, which added to his paycheck is $120.50. And yes, I went back to check if this was another $120 that was added, and not like the $120 that was already given to him. So what, are we to assume this seemingly abandoned pizza place doesn't run business on Saturdays? On top of that, Mike Schmidt is working 30 hours a week, 42 hours a week if you count nights 6 and 7. And that's not including the hectic as hell 420 mode on custom night, all by himself in a place which is decrepit and in need of repair, despite supposedly this place running smoothly during the daytime hours. If Keynesian economics was correct, and if we weren't so massively overworked long after K's passed, Mike Schmidt wouldn't be working for so many hours in the near dark. No, he would be working around 11.5 hours per week, since assuming everyone else is working 40 hours a week and he's working 30, that's still 76% of a 15-hour work week. To summarize, and putting aside the fact that this minimum wage stuff wasn't as thought out as it should have been when this game and this series was first conceived, and putting aside the lore for a moment, because I know this might end up being a failed attempt in suspending my disbelief regarding what's really going on in the FNAF world, not that one. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza is not some wacky enterprise where kids get to have fun. But this place did not give 2 fucks either for the health and safety of their night shift security guards, and also went out of their way to underpay their workers and find any means to cut corners, knowing that their workers could face injury or death. Then again, it's only appropriate to note the 1980s and 1990s timing of events in the game's universe, considering the rise of neoliberal economics starting with Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. In a slight way, playing Five Nights at Freddy's is like playing an unregulated capitalist nightmare. Not only can we demonstrably show that Mike Schmidt is a victim of wage theft working a bullshit job where he should be paid a living wage, but the biggest danger in Five Nights at Freddy's isn't the animatronics. No, it's the bosses who underpay their workers and put their lives at risk who are the real danger in this universe. The monster we put a McDonald's or a Chuck E. Cheese employee shirt on, or maybe a Freddy Fazbear mask to hide away from, is capitalism in all of its unfettered, poorly unregulated form, only making it worse for workers. It kinda makes you wonder why Fazbear daytime and nighttime workers didn't go on strike to demand better wages, and improve labor conditions when they weren't busy checking in on quirky Slippin' Freddy. So, in short, either this whole exercise in armchair economics was completely pointless, or I made a Fazbear communist out of you. That term is not a real term, FNAF fans. Please do not meme Fazbear communism on Twitter or Reddit. I cannot afford to be embarrassed if people took Fazbear communism seriously. Anyway, let's move on to a subject that positively reflects this game's legacy, at least in my opinion. So, is Five Nights at Freddy's art? That is a question I kept asking myself the more I sat down to start this script after hours of gameplay and getting far more comfortable playing Night 7 while toying with the AI settings before my 420 run. And it might be weird for the devotees of this franchise to hear me saying this, as they may not be thinking or overthinking about things beyond the text, or at least not thinking as hard on that as they are about theories related to the lore. Well, I don't care about theories. I care about facts. But regardless, it's a little strange that the indie game I am writing about today is radically different from the indie game I looked back at over a year ago last August, Gone Home, which condensed the theme of same-sex relationships and the acceptance or lack thereof of the LGBTQ+ community by focusing on a small family residing in the Pacific Northwest in the mid-1990s, and primarily honed in on the development of Sam, the younger sister of the game's main character Katie, and her romance with Lonnie, which ended up being the strongest element of the game. Gone Home as a game was fine, even good you can say, despite being surpassed in quality by other walking simulators, and the assumption people had, judging solely from the cover, was that this would involve a haunted house, which it kinda does given the family history, but thematically, the theme of coming out to your socially conservative family, with both of Sam's parents not outright being bigots, but rather in denial of Sam's relationship with Lonnie, as they both are having their own marital issues, is horrifying in a different sense, and I stand by my assessment that Gone Home is fine, despite the massive divide between critics and certain quote-unquote true gamers with their little homophobic Gone Homo videos and memes.
Okay, let's take a look at this brand new game made by some guy from 4chan. I think that pretty much guarantees the quality of this product. So, let's give it a go. Press F to open. Where is F in my keyboard? What the fuck? Oh, there it is. Man, I'm such a gamer. What's over here? Brother, I am gay. Wow, I'm at a loss for words. Too deep for me.
And yes, unfortunately, if this YouTuber's name sounds familiar to you, it's because supposedly this guy was the first YouTuber to achieve Five Nights at Freddy's first successful 420 run.
Yes! It was 7 minutes 43 seconds. We went over. It's done. It's fucking done, guys. Yes! Yes! Oh! Sorry, guys. We did it! Oh my god! Oh!
Not your best work, Buggy, my guy. But getting back to Gone Home, I can see that the game wanted to have a bigger impact on the issue of LGBTQ+ rights, and even now, as we're having similar hysterical backlash towards the transgender community, whether it's online or in red states in the United States passing anti-trans legislation, what made Gone Home stick out was its central message of recognizing the importance of acceptance when it hits home, even if it ends up being a mediocre gaming experience, and that's just fine. Hint hint for later. But it's also true that not every video game is required to have some big, giant, overarching theme, and sometimes smashing the controller buttons or keyboard is the only thing gamers want to do. I mean, sure, other great walking simulators like Firewatch and What Remains of Edith Finch do touch base on grief and death in their own respective ways, but do games like Tetris, Pac-Man, and Super Mario Bros. Require to be incredibly dense and rich beyond their designs in their virtual worlds? Of course not. Likewise with the original Five Nights at Freddy's, before the franchise's next 3 games. The trend of Let's Players on YouTube recording themselves getting jump scared every time they fucked up or forgot to check on Freddy or Foxy created some giggles and entertainment for viewers around the world, as well as sparking engagement for the gaming community in regard to theories related to the lore. Yet 99.99% of FNAF gamers probably couldn't explain, at the time, what was keeping their gaming experience together. So, what is the main theme of this game that keeps it all together? Mediocrity. Again, bear with me for a moment. Now, being a mediocre game is not inherently a bad thing. In fact, most indie games might seem mediocre, but to other gamers, it means a lot more to them because they find meaning in their own individual experience playing. Hell, as with all indie games, developers have to work on a budget and make sacrifices to make the best possible game, even if they can anticipate that their game is going to need a patch or two to fix bugs, and that's just fine. So, mediocre does not translate to bad experience. You could say Five Nights at Freddy's is the patron saint of video game mediocrity, and it could easily be applied to several other games in the franchise. But for now, let's stick to FNAF 1. The theme of mediocrity is all over this game, from the seemingly simple gameplay mechanics which gets easier the more you play, the graphics which kept simple with still images blended with the static you see in full opacity if you get jump scared. Speaking of which, even the jump scare animations are only a few frames, but just looking at the office along with the various cameras, what the game does so well is depict a decrepit establishment on the brink of being closed off completely. The minimalist soundscape using its layered ambient background music and which doesn't pound you with some booming bass synth, the very limited voice cast, and all taking place at a pizza place where the pizza probably wouldn't crack a 2 or 3 out of 10 on the pizza scale. I should know because I read the ingredients to make the pizza while reading the Freddy files. Fuck, do I not want to know what Fazbear's Twisted Pizza tastes like. Something about fast food pizzeria pizza like the one at Chuck E. Cheese's makes me want to vomit. But more importantly, when passing the base game and then nights 6 and 7, Five Nights at Freddy's depicts the very mediocre experience of barely getting by, especially when late game runs means having to beg the game not to let Freddy jump scare you when the power runs out, and hope 6 AM hits. For Christ's sake, you're playing as a security guard alone in an establishment which will inevitably be shut off from the look of it. Hell, mediocre Mike Schmidt in this game, besides his bland sounding name, has no personality or even voice lines that help us to relate to his faceless character. That's when his head is not forced into one of those Freddy heads, and yet we fill the gaps in his character so we can try and relate to his experience. What if we were struggling to make ends meet and we had to take this security job? And all of it for a measly $120, which in today's economy ain't paying the rent, water, or electric bills, but at least half of it will pay for a AAA game. I can't help but try and remember all of those times I saw security guys at my old office job wondering what their lives were, what they were doing after business hours, stuck at the workplace in night hours with nothing exciting to do. It makes me feel some empathy for those who have to partake in mediocre work. Because Five Nights at Freddy's is about anticipating something more than just surviving another day or having to deal with quirky animatronics. Let me put it this way. What if instead of a security job in this game, right now you're working an ordinary desk job for an IT company from 9 to 5, and barely anything exciting happens for most of your Monday to Friday schedule. A bullshit job which might seem like it's important, until you realize this keeps going on for more than one day or night. Remove all of the jump scares and animatronics in this game, and Five Nights at Freddy's is about the working man trying to get by just another day, in one of the dullest, bleakest, dilapidated, and depressing working environments ever depicted in gaming. A contrast from the constantly bleeping email alerts and phone calls in the work level in Melatonin, nowhere near the escapist fantasy of living a rural farm life like in Stardew Valley or Harvest Moon. And since I talked about it not too long ago, if Dave the Diver is about a man living a perfect life where his diving and sushi work couldn't even be considered work, then Mike Schmidt is working in the decay of a capitalist nightmare in which there is no escape, no bus to hop onto and get to Stardew Valley. No, he's stuck at the pizzeria where the work environment is neglected and the animatronics are roaming amok, and the game's timing couldn't be more appropriate considering 1993, when the game is set, was well after the damage inflicted by Reagan economics and inequality only getting worse for America since the 1980s. But hey, at least our game's hero gets a nice congrats after collecting that paycheck. B for the pink slip, of course. Maybe it's the fear of having to work some job you don't want, but you have to because the other option is to face homelessness. And this is why it's so important to point out the comparison between Five Nights at Freddy's and Papers, Please, and to understand why both games had their own respective success, despite their seemingly different dangerous environmental stories. Each game's respective job, when applied to the real world, is pedantic. In Papers, Please, as a beginning gamer, I was tempted to throw my hands up and get mad with myself because I forgot that some names on documents are different, or that I got a country wrong. But the need for something more beyond the desk job is there, as well as the anticipation that something could happen during your shift. Whether it's a political protester crossing the fence in a do or die situation, moving up the socio-political ladder while making morally questionable decisions, or the dread and anxiety of hearing the robotic whispers of Freddy by your side because your joystick accidentally moved away from camera 4B while you were too busy checking both doors. Five Nights at Freddy's is, at best, a mediocre game, produced in the most mediocre fashion, without the flashiest promotion or flair, compared to the trailer you see for Security Breach. And I think an honest FNAF gamer would have to concede this point. And that's okay, because that lack of flash and flare was made up by Five Nights at Freddy's strongest elements that made the game stick out from the pack of indie horror games released in its decade, and even its own series it started 10 years looking back. A game that felt unique, one which got the community involved in something positive for most involved. Where other horror franchises would retool their latest additions to their series, here was a game which was doing its own thing, at least for the moment. The original Five Nights at Freddy's is not only the best game out of the 4 original Five Nights at Freddy's games, which released between 2014 and 2015, and so good that it's the only game of the series I would put in the S tier if we were doing an official tier list ranking, and a 9 out of 10 which comes with a yellow flannel. But the first Five Nights at Freddy's game has managed to stay on top of the series as the truly definitive Five Nights at Freddy's game, a truly influential game in the indie horror gaming scene, despite its flaws and gameplay which gets easier with time, and historically speaking as a point-and-click game when played on PC, can hold its own along with The Seventh Guest. As a landmark, gamers will remember where they were when they first watched a FNAF Let's Play, or tried out the game for themselves, and see how long they could play before getting jump scared. And while it is easy to make fun of this game, and the franchise as a whole for its goofy, creepy, and funny-looking animatronics, even the ones which are trying too hard to be scary in future releases, its predictable jump scares when being a regular FNAF gamer, and sometimes batshit stuff, especially when it pertains to the lore. What separates the first game from the other games, which came after it, was a combination of environmental storytelling, ambience, and sound design, including effective sound effects, and this involves those magical words, atmosphere, mystery, and mediocrity. And that is why it's amazing to look back and see just how much the original Five Nights at Freddy's holds up incredibly well. Yes, the name of this chapter is the actual conclusion and not the chapter before. Of course, the key phrase in that last sentence is on its own, because the flip side to being generous and positive about a game I didn't care much about when it released 10 years ago, and one which I didn't bother to revisit until nearly a decade later, is that as the series progressed and the FNAF universe expanded to include more animatronics, game mechanics, story lore, and confirmation on whether popular fan theories turned out to be true or not, it became clear that the cracks were starting to show with the next few games, and these cracks would affect the legacy of the first game standing as part of the broader FNAF universe. As I finish writing this chapter, I think of a quote from a book I am forced to revisit for this project. Quote, "To go back is nothing but death. To go forward is fear of death, and life everlasting beyond it. I will yet go forward." Well, I don't believe in a life after this, and I am forced to go back to see why I can never have the same appreciation for the rest of the games as other fans do. And yet, I do believe that the title of this saga, Forever Freddy, is very apt, after all, as the Big Bear himself once said,
"When you wake up, just remember, Friends are forever.
My main contention in this ongoing saga, and maybe it's yours as well, looking back at all of the games, books, and film, is that despite the first game putting itself in indie game immortality with its unexpected success and massive fan support online, the Five Nights at Freddy's series was at risk of letting its toys wither too quickly. In fact, it makes you wonder, whoever was in charge of this franchise operation probably didn't know what the hell they were doing going forward. Well, that's the first video essay in this series. Thank you all so much for taking the time to watch this Five Nights at Freddy's 1 retrospective, and the very first episode in the Forever Freddy saga, if you stuck around for this long. Apologies for being so late on this one. Let's check the date. Woo! We're still technically in the 10-year range for FNAF 1. So yeah, this is a 10-year retrospective. I'm counting it. Don't try to debate me. If you haven't already done so, please give this video a like, comment, share elsewhere on social media, and if you would like to support the work I do, please consider subscribing to my channel to watch more essays like this, and also consider supporting my work through my newly created Armchair Brain Patreon page to help support projects like this. Patrons will get early access to video essays before they premiere, as well as get a shout out at the end of my video essays. My goal for this channel is to hit the 1,000 subscriber milestone by the end of the year, and I hope the work I put into this channel helps me reach that goal. So check out the Armchair Brain channel and my other video essays if you haven't done so already, and if you're interested, hopefully all of you will stick around for more episodes in this mini-series, because there will be more. Oh yes, there will indeed be more time for Freddy Time. In fact, the very next episode will be, well, it was supposed to be this November because the 11th of November would be the 10th anniversary of FNAF 2, like I said, but clearly that's not going to happen, given this one took a little too much time to complete. In fact, this one was supposed to premiere in August, but things got in the way of production. But thank goodness this one premiered just a little over the 10th anniversary date for FNAF 1, so no biggie. So let me explain the origin of this Forever Freddy miniseries and this essay. Originally, this video essay you just finished watching was supposed to be a massive 3-hour one-and-done video essay, and I was planning to never talk about this franchise ever again, and or make a video solely on FNAF, or any future FNAF games ever again. But as I was finishing the first draft last January and I got up to the 15,000 word mark, it was obvious to me that this was going to be a bigger project and it was going to take longer than 3 hours to talk about. But I don't like to focus on one game or one franchise for too long, unless it's, say, Zelda. And I have other video essays which I want to be able to complete, which discuss other video games. So I decided to compromise and create a limited episodic series on the FNAF franchise, meaning that there's at least 10 episodes that I want to work on, as well as a grand finale planned, which I already have a title and subject for, and I will no longer have to talk solely about FNAF ever again on this channel. Enjoy this brief video essay mini-series for now. There might be more episodes if needed. But right now, there's at least 10 episodes which discuss 8 FNAF games I want to do retrospectives on, and which, unfortunately, I have to play these games and replay again and again, both on Nintendo Switch and on my MacBook. Oh, and also, this series gives me an opportunity to discuss the rise of Gamergate and the right-wing hijacking of geek nerd culture, which preceded the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and why I think it's important to discuss toxic gaming culture, toxic masculinity, and toxic fan culture. which, yes, it does exist in the FNAF community like every other fan community. I can think of at least 2 people in particular who have gotten themselves in trouble for, shall we say, pretty gross behavior, but that's for another time. However, going forward, I want to make it clear that I do not want myself or my YouTube channel to be defined as a FNAF gamer or FNAF fan channel. No disrespect to any FNAF channels out there, I want to be known as a gaming and media critic, which there are a ton out there who I respect and follow, and whether it's this or Zelda, any immersive sim, or Metroidvania, I think there's a lot more to this franchise than people think, because I always say, video games say more about us than ordinary people might think. I also have to note that because the original script was too long, there were a number of chapters that were cut and may be uploaded for another time. For example, I talked about YouTube critic Ben Yahtzee Croshaw and how he inspired me as a writer to use my philosophy degree and my writing craft to make video essays on video games, and how his reviews of the original Five Nights at Freddy's and Security Breach differ so much in tone due to the quality between games, helped to inspire me to look deeper into the FNAF games. I also had a chapter on everyone's favorite FNAF fan band, The Living Tombstone, which served as a critique of their music inspired by the FNAF games, and me being something of a musician myself, it would be an opportunity to talk about music for a change, since I have been meaning to branch out into music. But I found that the original script I had written may have been a little too mean-spirited, and I want to be as generous and fair as possible, so I will be saving these 2 chapters for another time. Oh, and one last thing while we're on the subject of music, don't even bother to ask me how long and painful it took me to come up with a theme song for the series at the beginning. Like, I had an idea as to what it was going to sound like half a year ago, and I probably should have replaced the dark synths with a fuzzed out jazz master, but this'll have to do. FL Studio is not exactly the most ideal avenue for professional music production. Don't know how everyone out there is going to react to the theme, but I hope it sets the tone for the series going forward. Anyway, thank you all so much for sticking around and watching, and I will see you in the next one. Hope you all have a good day and enjoy the rest of the year.